An ordinary office worker blinked in confusion and suddenly found himself trapped in a stranger's body, yanking at his own cheek in pure disbelief as one terrifying realization slowly started to hit. He locked eyes with his reflection and froze, because somehow he'd been turned into a fat kid and it felt completely unreal. He took in the lavish room in one sweep, clocking the weird furniture and the view outside his window, then blurted, shaking his head, "Where am I supposed to be?" Staring out the window, he realized with a jolt that this wasn't Japan at all, and it sure as hell wasn't the same era he remembered. He tried to drag his memories back and one brutal night slammed into him. He'd missed the last train, then staggered home utterly wrecked. Right then a terrifying truth snapped into focus. He'd been hit by a truck, he was dead, and somehow he'd been reborn. He tore into the air screaming, pure terror in his throat. He reeled from the shock, and just then a nasty knock thundered at the door, making him jump. From outside, a voice called out, "It's Anna." Anna, his maid, burst in and demanded to know what was going on, calling him Klaus, and that hit him like a memory he couldn't place. He shot an apology back for his outburst, then forced his breathing steady and asked what the rest of his day was supposed to look like. He froze with wide eyes as the maid, Anna, dropped the news that Latte Erling Sama, his fiancée, was coming this afternoon, and the moment that name hit, a sick déjà vu slammed into him. He was Klaus Muller. The moment it hit him, he realized this world was the exact battleground of supernova gnosis. Like a roguelike he'd been totally hooked on for ages. And now Klaus found himself trapped in a whole new world where the main heroine was named Latte. He relived Klaus Muller's humiliating role in the game, just a pathetic stooge who kept lunging at the heroines, only to get shut down again and again by the real protagonist. And those botched assaults somehow ended up forging even tighter bonds between him and the women. He was barely a speck of a character. The Gnosis crowd even mocked him as an affection booster for the main heroines, while Anna watched his frantic face and looked completely lost. In pure panic, he whipped around to Anna and blurted that he had to know, did he look like a cruel, fat guy? Her nerves snapped, she jerked back, and down she went onto the floor. Then his eyes caught her slim frame and the truth hit him. She was anything but fatty. He shot off, asking if she was okay, but his mind was still in chaos. Then he blurted out if she maybe just loved fat people before snapping back, because her reaction screamed that was definitely not true. He caught her skinny legs and the terror in her eyes, and guilt hit him hard, like he'd been brutal to her, because it was obvious she hadn't been eating right at all. He bowed his head and apologized to Anna with real sincerity for dragging her into all that distress, while Anna just stood there, utterly stunned by his sudden shift in attitude. With a brand new fire in his chest, he thrust a plate of food into her hands and practically demanded she eat. She was way too thin. Anna's eyes flooded with tears as she reeled from the sheer kindness she didn't see coming. Then he straight up declared he'd been reborn and vowed that from that day on, everything would change. Her tears finally slowed, and he kept a gentle grip on her hand, urging her to stop crying. So she nodded and agreed in a voice that barely made a sound. He then swore he'd be back before Latte even arrived, tore into something more athletic in a hurry, and with a fierce look in his eyes he declared, "I'm going for a run and starting my diet," while Anna stood there stunned. As he kicked off his run, he stared in awe at the estate's massive sprawl, bigger than he'd ever imagined. He remembered, the Duke Muller family lived in the eastern slice of the Garluca kingdom, and Latte's people, the Count Erling family, were right next door. The garden stretched on forever, swallowing his momentum, and he staggered out of breath, gasping hard as he fought to keep exercising. He forced himself into a hidden corner, scanned for anyone watching, and when the coast was clear, he shot his hand out like he was in the game, trying to pull up his status screen. Frustration hit hard, nothing happened, so he tried again, but the interface he was counting on never showed up. He leaned in and wondered if he needed totally different commands, tossing around other keywords like skill, interface, or even status open. The book lit up with two entries, one weird skill called asterisk skill book asterisk, and one plain one named indolent sleep asterisk, and he realized his proficiency would climb with every use. Indolent sleep sounded amazing with comfy sleep, energy absorption, and natural healing, but he couldn't shake the fear that it might also turn him into a lazy, fat mess. Because that skill was so rare, he clutched the book like treasure, swore he'd keep it hidden, and refused to invite trouble he didn't need. He sprinted across the open field, his thoughts screaming for him to make it back to the mansion. Right when he arrived, a grand carriage was waiting outside the mansion, and a bunch of staff, including Anna, the office worker, were there to greet a young girl, while he immediately squared his shoulders, fixed his vest, and got ready. As he stared at the girl, recognition slammed into him, Latte, younger than he'd seen in the game, just as stunning as he remembered. He blurted out her title, Sovereign Beauty, and a jolt of pure excitement ripped through him as the game's story hit his mind all over again. Suddenly, Latte's game memories slammed into his head like lightning, and his thoughts screamed her name. Still trapped in his game-fueled fantasies, he suddenly blurted her name and reached for Latte on impulse. Then her eyes went wide, startled and clearly uneasy at his sudden move. She flinched back a little, eyebrows knit in pure confusion, and as he stared at her reaction you could see it hit him. He had no clue why she'd just recoil. Latte nervously blurted, "Did I do something to you?" Then immediately waved it off. "No," she said, "everything was fine." She flashed a tight smile and thanked him way too much, but the discomfort practically radiated off her, and her gratitude didn't sound real at all. All the other staff just stood there, staring at the cringy exchange. Later, they set up an outdoor tea party. He and Latte faced each other across a tiny table, while Anna and her mate slid in to pour steaming tea and lay out pastries. As Latte calmly sipped her tea, nervousness crawled up his spine and he couldn't stop watching, because it finally hit him. Latte wasn't just some bystander. She was engaged to the Claws, the very original villain of this world. He stirred his tea with a sharp, nervous focus, because this was totally out of the blue. There was never any mention of an engagement in the game, so he could only assume it got scrapped long before the story even kicked off. Depression crashed over him as he stared into the future, realizing this timeline still had a few long years left before the game's real start. He kept replaying the game's story in his head, zeroing in on Latte at the start, cold as ice, sitting in a wheelchair shut off like her heart was locked away from everyone, until the saint's magic woke her back up, and every time she talked with the protagonist she slowly began to shine. While he wrestled with those grim thoughts, his world carried on. He kept eating, and Latte watched him in quiet, unreadable silence. Then his thoughts snapped to the exact moves that sealed his fate, charging at the heroines in the game with zero restraint until they drove him off. And while he spiraled, Latte calmly called off their engagement. These weren't even his worst crimes. He'd keep racking up bad deeds and it would all end with a horrifying public execution that made the whole crowd freeze in terror. That vivid memory slammed him back into the present. He choked out a gasp, understood how close he was to disaster, and swore he had to dodge that death flag at any cost because he refused to let it happen. His sudden panic right in the worst moment made him blunder instantly. He poured way too much sugar and his tea overflowed like crazy, while Latte recoiled, visibly disgusted by his clumsy outburst. That crushing silence hit like a wave, and he could practically feel his mistake sinking in. He panicked, searching for a way to break the tension, until Anna, one of the maids, leaned in and asked if Klaus-sama was only trying to calm Latte-sama's nerves. Even with Anna's hopeful read on the situation, Latte's reaction killed the optimism. She stayed silent, eyes glued to the ground, and her real feelings stayed locked away. Even while Anna stayed quiet, her buddy Klaus let out a chuckle, thanked her for real, and with a grin light and sure as a bell said, "That's right." Latte's eyes dropped, and the more she replayed Klaus's past, the more it burned. He'd always used her like some tool, nothing more. When Klaus watched her closely, he gently said her name, but she answered with a weary calm, admitting she just didn't understand him anymore. She shot her gaze up at him, stunned that he'd suddenly gone kind, and demanded to know why he'd changed. Then his face burned red as he admitted he couldn't keep living that old way anymore and was ready to change for real. Her eyes went wide as she pushed him harder, asking if he meant it, and even though he was still flustered, he nodded, swearing he was completely sincere. With a hard stare, she dared him to prove he meant it, and his face instantly flashed with shock. With unshakable grit, she demanded his transformation hit hard from the very first glance, and Klaus just watched, sweat beading on his brow as she dropped the ultimatum. In 1 month, he had to shed enough weight for everyone to see it. Young Klaus Muller stood in front of his family's butler, who warned him that anything about Duke Muller, Klaus's father, had to be taken straight to the Duke first. Klaus asked if he could see his father, and the butler bowed politely and promised he'd check right away whether the Duke was available. So Klaus thanked him, grateful. As Klaus bolted away, questions about his father, Garum, rattled in his head. Because they didn't even live under the same roof, their bond had to be strained to the breaking point. Klaus stared across the huge Duke Muller family lands, swallowing the miles until they vanished past the nearest town. And when he learned his better-than-mother was recovering far away, dread hit him. Someone was cutting him off, and it felt like his own parents might have left him behind. Moments later, Anna the maid rushed up to the panting Claus with a cool drink in hand, and he snatched it gratefully, thanking her like she'd saved his breath. While the other maids huddled in whispery corners, they doubted Klaus's change and wondered if he could actually stick to his diet. Klaus caught every word, annoyance flaring in his chest, and with it came a sharp sting of sympathy for Latte-sama. Then he looked back on how cruel he'd been to Anna, swore he'd get thin, and vowed to make everyone's faces light up with shock. And when he finally turned to her, he asked, "Why were you always so kind to me, even after everything I did?"
What?
With a soft smile on her face, Anna told him he saved her life. When she was an orphan with nowhere to go, he took her in and gave her a real home. Flaws snapped to a wild, quick vision of his older, bigger self, laughing and telling everyone that Anna would grow into a fine woman. And then he threw the thought away just as fast, because he knew deep down his past self probably cared more about looks than anything real. He spun toward Anna and asked if she'd go with him. Anna snapped into a shocked gasp, eyes blazing wide. Then he admitted he needed to meet his father, but he stalled, torn up about what to do next, and Anna, feeling the strain, asked what was breaking him. He admitted things between them felt totally broken, and he couldn't let it end without answers. Anna's face creased with worry as she asked if he'd really be okay going to meet her father all by himself. He just called her name and she lit up with a soft smile, telling him for real that he'd changed, and that his father would finally recognize him now. He thought about Anna's steady kindness and swore he'd meet her expectations. Then panic hit hard when he realized he had no PC with PowerPoint for his presentation. But just as fast, his grit surged and he pumped himself up to prepare for the whole scale. He tore into the quills and hit a wall. Those unfamiliar tools just wouldn't cooperate. So with a heavy sigh, he gave up and went old school, painstakingly writing everything by hand. Several days later, the moment finally hit. He stood before the grand main house, stunned by how huge it looked, while Anna beside him warned him to stay sharp and behave because Garam-sama would judge his fate that very day. Then another butler, acting like he didn't care at all, just scoffed, "Break a leg," and he nearly couldn't believe what he heard. The moment they stepped into the room, he finally locked eyes with his father, the Duke. His huge, stern beard and razor-sharp gaze blasting an aura so intense it felt downright terrifying, and a cold shiver hit him as he realized, yeah, this was the kind of scary you couldn't ignore. He felt crushed by his father's towering presence, and in his head he kept blurting, "How is he even that huge?" The other servants in the room froze, then gasped and traded whispers as they watched the tense standoff, while Duke Garamuller just calmly said, "I came." And right then, he couldn't help wondering if his smaller build meant he took after his mother. The crew finally dropped into a huge, lavish room, and right away, he clocked a body weight scale sitting out in the open like the strangest trophy in the middle of all that fancy decor. He just had to ask why anyone needed a body weight scale. Couldn't you spot overweight just by looking? Then his father cut him off and said it mattered for the Mueller family's night tactics, straight and blunt. Feeling that dismissive vibe, he swallowed his pride, cleared his throat, and got ready to unleash the sales skills he'd sharpened back when he was a corporate slave. He kept going, snapping his point into focus. Because you don't magically drop a pound just by hitting the toilet after eating a pound of meat, and his father's math was totally off. He stressed that your body weight will always wiggle a little day to day, because every bite you eat and every meal you digest is always in motion. He slammed the idea down with total confidence. His scale would help them nail that perfect weight. His father got it too, knowing that even a 2-pound drop could make a rider's horse faster, but if they went too far, the armor would become so heavy to move that they'd be stuck. He braced himself to drop his sob story, praying his tears would light the fuse. And just as his father finally sounded convinced, Klaus's heart went wild as his eyes rang out, sealing the deal and leaving him fully charged and ready. With a dramatic flair, he blurted out to his father, tears pouring down his face. Still fighting back tears, he poured out his heart, insisting that the body weight scale was built from the start to secure a brighter future for the Mueller family. His father's heart hammered in plain sight, crushed by the impact of those words. Klaus, grinning through tears, announced he'd finally turned over a new leaf and only wanted to be useful now. And Duke Garam, utterly convinced, snapped that he'd okay the production right away. Then he whipped out a diagram and said the scale's core idea was basically a spring. His father pressed him on what exact mechanism it would use, and Klaus shot back with heartfelt, non-stop gratitude. While his father studied the diagram, he barked at the butler to fetch a scholar. And just moments later, a tall blonde woman swept in, bowed to Duke Garam and clocked the claws in an instant. Then her eyes snapped to the device, and she asked straight up if it was a body weight scale. The scholar, clutching the diagram, lit up at the idea and promised to start right away. Duke Garam nodded, pleased, saying he was counting on her while Klaus watched, practically vibrating with excitement. She said that with the right materials, the scale would take about a month to make. Then the Duke just watched his son and confirmed the rumors weren't lies. The change was real. Then he crushed the boy in a tight embrace, still stunned that someone so young could dream up and pull off something this intense. Still clutching him close, the Duke admitted he'd once panicked over his son's future, begging him not to let him down again. While Klaus, tucked in his father's arms, saw him as a good dad and even thought, with a bitter little sting, that he was the real idiot. The boy grabbed his dad's worry and soothed him, telling him he'd be fine now. While inside he tracked the wind like a steady climb, until at last things were good again between them. As the emotional reunion finally wrapped up, the butler flashed a quiet thumbs up, and Anna the maid stared on, brows knitting with worry. Later that night, back at their place, he finally tumbled into the bed he'd been helped into, still groaning about the brutal 4-hour carriage ride, while she beamed with happiness. While she cared for him, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the call to return to the main residence was coming fast, especially after that warm, lingering hug he shared with his father. She promised she'd cheer for him from a distance, and Klaus, still confused, blurted out what she meant by from afar, while vowing he'd do everything he could to make his father proud. He blurted out in shock as Anna spilled her fears, because a clumsy maid like her would be tossed aside and fired the second he left the smaller residence. with a whole bunch of sharper, more capable maids waiting at the main estate. Anna's own personal maid label got slammed down with fierce certainty. No one was ever going to fire her, and he made it crystal clear he didn't want anyone else, not now and not ever. He locked eyes with Anna, spoke with absolute honesty, and vowed they'd face it all together. Then she broke down, thanking him again and again, tears pouring as she clutched her hands to her chest. Later that evening, she leaned in and kissed him goodnight, her voice trembling with quiet joy, and when she finally walked away, a gentle, radiant glow seemed to spill from her, her eyes blazing with brand new hope and happiness. Next morning, he sprawled in bed and stretched slow, sunlight spilling through the window, and a soft murmur slipped out of him, just thinking about Anna. Suddenly, his eyes shot wide open with pure alarm, and a towering shadow stretched over his bed. He jerked back, flailing a hand out as a sharp gasp ripped from his throat. A fresh day broke open, and with it came the third chapter of the saga, Skill Bearers. Young Klaus Muller jolted as a blade flashed into view right in front of him, clutched in the hands of a hard-faced man. Moments later, the night captain blasted a screaming horn, snapping awake the second the sound hit and jolting his claws out of bed. While Anna the maid rushed in, forgot her duty to wake him, and still face-planted in a panic. Mukai the night captain Klaus instantly recognized, rushed in and told him he'd overslept, while Anna lay sprawled on the floor, groaning in agony from a brutal sliding faceplant. Mukai blurted out that Duke Garum had ordered him to hammer claws and swordplay and every other combat skill, so he'd better be ready. And Claus, stunned by the sudden demand, admitted his only edge might come from how he used to watch horse races, even though he'd never actually ridden a single one. Their very first assignment, horsemanship. When the Claus lunged to latch onto the horse, Mukai snapped his posture straight away, pounding home that he had to keep his back aligned and lock in the proper form. After the horsemanship lesson, Mukai dragged Claus straight into swordsmanship and thrust a real blade into his hands, and Claus, sure he had this from watching mecha anime, found out fast that the sword's real weight was nothing like TV, and it crashed his confidence in seconds. Mukai snapped Klaus back into the right stance, showing him how to grip that monster blade properly. Then he dared Klaus to swing at him, swore he wouldn't fight back, and promised he was safe. Klaus still worried he'd get hurt using real swords, but Mukai cut him off, boasting that as the night captain, a kid couldn't possibly hurt him. With a fierce, determined look, Klaus surged forward and went for Mukai, but the night captain was faster, parrying every strike like it was nothing. Struggling to keep his footing, Klaus finally got it. Everything he'd seen in old period dramas couldn't prepare him for real swordplay, because it was nothing like the smooth, stylized samurai fights he swore he remembered. His tiny frame buckled under the night captain's sheer power, fighting like hell just to keep up, and Mukai snapped the lesson into place. In sword fights, whoever hits harder and has the stronger power always controls the upper hand, showing the basic Western moves, slashes, and deadly thrusts. Defeated, he dropped to his knees, swearing about how useless his small body felt, while Mukai watched his strain and praised him for holding up so well for a kid. Then, without a hint of mercy, the captain surged forward again, slamming into him so fast he never even saw it coming. Mukai told them to ditch the real swords for training, and the moment the claws caught that pause, a weird jolt hit, like letters and words roaring in like a gale, suddenly started spawning inside his mind. Still reeling from the shock of all that information, he raged through it and refused to stop, demanding one more round. Mukai, stunned by the sheer intensity, could only blurt his name like, "Are you serious?" Mukai thought for a split second, then threw in one last exchange. He blared a determined shout, sprinted forward, and launched himself into a crushing, perfectly focused strike. He slammed out attack after attack, a streak of motion from every angle, thinking raw speed would throw his opponent off since his strength just wasn't there. But Mukai, while snuffed every strike with razor-sharp parries, watching the boy's weird technique like it was a puzzle. He unleashed a single, crushing strike meant to end it in one hit, and when Mukai saw the move, he shot out of the way in an instant. He froze in bewilderment, then realized a sword technique had basically erupted straight from his own mind, while Mukai, just as stunned, admitted that display was insanely impressive. He leaned in and asked Mukai if what he'd just pulled off was some normal skill, and Mukai told him the truth. Only a rare kind of special person could ever land skills like that. Shock hit him hard. Why did those rare skills even matter? Mukai clamped a grip on his shoulder and barked what he'd done to learn about them, and he shot back that he'd read it all in the library. Then Mukai pushed again, demanding the exact difference between a normal skill and a unique one. Klaus lunged to shout, but the butler was already mounted and fired off, declaring he'd report the whole incident to Garum-sama. Then he vanished at full gallop before Klaus could even grab him. Even after the butler bolted, Klaus still felt heat in his cheeks, so he brushed it off and insisted his move wasn't a big deal at all. But Anna was totally stunned, blurting that she couldn't believe he was a skill bearer and calling it straight up unbelievable. She kept teasing him and his blushing face made her grin, so he finally flailed and begged her to stop. but she only blinked back with a soft smile and said she'd make dinner, tipping her hat to the fact that he was starving after training. He then admitted his quiet fear, asking if she worried he'd snap back into his old self. She soothed him, but warned him that people who gain skills start believing they're special, and he instantly shook his head, trying to explain what he really felt. He stared into her eyes with raw sincerity, swore he'd never be that cruel, fat jerk again, and promised he'd change for good. She just waved it off and told him, "Don't worry." Then he pushed her ahead, grinning like he had no choice. He had to hit the toilet. She watched him vanish down the hall, whispering his name after him. All alone with the coast clear, he yanked out his skill book and tore into it, his heart racing to see what he'd earned. Sure enough, his swordsmanship had climbed to level 2, unlocking a sword technique called *** Gale Strike ***. He didn't doubt it for a second. This was the payoff from his training. He scanned his whole skill list and spotted it, his one-of-a-kind skill book sitting at level 1. While his regular skills showed indolent sleep at level 3 and swordsmanship at level 2, and then it hit him. He could tap the names to turn abilities on or off, or even tuck them away from sight. So he immediately hid that unique skill, terrified of the chaos if anyone caught wind of it, and he shut down indolent sleep too because it was wrecking his diet. A little later, the day finally crashed in his promised tea party with Latte. Anna hustled him through the setup, barking that he had to stay perfectly still, while he stared at his now slim body like it was proof the nightmare was over, even as he worried those hidden fat reserves might still be lurking. Still, he clenched his resolve and announced, "I'm ready." He greeted Latte and motioned her to sit, and when she stared back with wide, shocked eyes, she blurted that he'd lost so much weight. Then he leaned in and asked if she could finally believe his words, like he was calling in on a promise he'd made before. Latte, still holding her tongue, stared back at what happened before, and she knew that old Claus would have dragged his ducal weight in to trap her into an engagement, right there, with a viscount's daughter like her. She still hadn't spilled the whole truth to him, and she couldn't be shocked by why. Klaus, in his current skin, chewed out his past self in his head, calling him the biggest idiot alive for what he did to his favorite heroine. Latte stayed silent, her eyes drifting off somewhere far away, while Klaus-sama watched her like something had snapped. He desperately wanted her back to her usual self, cool on the outside and playful underneath. She stared straight at him and promised she'd show him her real self, just like she'd pledged to back his resolve to change, while Claus couldn't shake the crushing weight of her words. Then he urged them to kick things off with a smile, swearing it would feel right if they could talk like that. Latte tried to obey, but his grin came out tight and fake, and Klaus clocked it instantly as insincere. Stung by her clumsy attempt, he snapped his hands over his face and swore he wasn't even there. Then he turned to Latte and dared her, saying if she couldn't make it happen, he'd step in and force a smile out of her himself. He tried a peekaboo gesture, yanking a comical, wide-eyed face, like it would work again. He even mused that it had nailed it with his 3-year-old nephew, so it probably wouldn't land with girls, and Latte smothered a tiny laugh. Latte felt it, her whole spirit screamed, "I'll make him smile." As she finally cracked into a real, glowing smile, and Claus lit up, calling it unbelievably cute, just like he'd expected from his favorite heroine. With that breakthrough, Klaus felt like he'd just taken a huge leap forward. Then, with Latte, he kept the conversation going in a calm, easy flow while Anna served them. That night, rain hammered the mansion. Claus stayed curled up in bed, and he worried sick that Latte might have gotten home safe. Then a brutal knock rattled his door, and when he finally opened it, he realized the late visitor was Anna. A soft knock jolted him, and when he swung the door open, Anna stood there in her nightgown, gripping a lantern, saying she couldn't sleep, her face torn between raw vulnerability and deep worry. Then she ended up sitting on his bed in her nightclothes, and when he told her to take a seat, she realized he wasn't just charming. He was a real smooth talker, and it threw him into a painfully awkward moment. As her mind drifted, she realized it wasn't just Duke Garam and Latte who adored him. Soon, countless others would too, and the truth of how much he was rising in importance hit her like a wave. She bowed her head and apologized for being a bad maid, shame burning in every word, while he fretted that he'd stressed her out again, because even with all her duties, she was still just a kid. He looked her straight in the eye and snapped that she wasn't a bad maid, then told her he needed her to help him sleep. Anna startled, but she clenched her resolve and promised she'd do her best. She started singing a lullaby, her voice drifting soft and sweet through the room as he lay in bed, and the idea of them sleeping together hit him like a sudden jolt. Then he shook it off and accepted it, realizing how badly she meant it. She kept the melody going, her lyrics painting a quiet forest and a wild walk toward the abyss, and he just stared, shocked by how serious, deep, and oddly profound those lullaby words were. His eyelids started to feel like weights as Anna's lullaby kept rolling, spinning wisdom, dancing shadows, and that eerie whisper of the abyss tugging him under, until her voice promised a radiant star and the road ahead, and he finally drifted into a deep, helpless sleep. Far from that quiet bedroom, the Duke was on a balcony, braving a brutal thunderstorm while lightning tore open the night sky below him. Knight Captain Mukai fired off a jaw-dropping report. Claus was a skill bearer. The Duke's face snapped hard with shock and disbelief. His face twisted, pure shock ripping into blazing fury, and the Duke snapped, ordering Mukai to drag them here immediately, his voice razor-sharp and demanding. 3 weeks had slammed by since the tea party with Latte and Klaus, hungry to level up, started tearing into relentless training, pumping out push-ups right in a muddy puddle like nothing else mattered. With no internet and no games, that was basically his only weapon. So he doubled down on his diet, swore he'd earn Latte's trust again, and chased the goal of seeing her smile return. As he pushed through his training in the woods, a butler barked his call time to leave for the main residence, and Klaus nodded at the summits, ready to take on whatever came next. He let the applause fade, stared at his book like it was a shortcut, and thought maybe switching it back on could save my image. Maybe Dad would blame the weight gain on my skill instead of my diet. He'd turned it off because it was messing with his whole dieting plan. A few hours later, Klaus stormed up to the grand main residence with the butler and Anna in tow, announced himself loud and clear, and got ready to square off with his father. Duke Garam Muller, his own father, met him head-on with a presence so intense it felt like a storm, and Klaus immediately got hit with that same wave of intimidation. The Duke's stern stare pinned Klaus in place as he blurted out that Knight Captain Mukai had sensed a skill awakening in his son. Klaus's eyes widened with pure dread. A sly little smile curled on the Duke's lips as he verified the report was true. Then he snapped his hands onto Klaus's shoulders and right out of nowhere, blurted an apology for keeping him waiting. Klaus stared stunned as his terrifyingly powerful father dropped into a respectful bow for a stranger who had just arrived, and it hit him. This wasn't some random visit. Cardinals sat at the very top. Then the butler stepped in and announced the guest with full weight. Cardinal Naruka, who traveled all the way from the royal capital just to appraise Klaus's skills. He stood there perfectly composed as the figure in front of him bowed to acknowledge his arrival, because everyone knew cardinals ruled with power that could match or even outshine a marquis. When the formal greetings finally wrapped up, Klaus, the young boy, stepped forward and said he was the eldest son of Marquis Muller, his father, Duke Garam. Then suddenly blurted, proud as anything, that his foolish son had just turned over a new leaf, and the cardinal shot back that Klaus wasn't anything like the rumors claimed. The Duke racked his brain, wondering if those claws held some insane skill, while the cardinal clocked his strange change in attitude and swore it had to be tied to his power finally waking up, because both of them are basically guessing. Meanwhile, deep down he realized he'd truly gained two skills, indolent sleep and swordsmanship, while his special skill book was safely tucked away. Then the cardinal barked orders for him to slap his hand on the oracle crystal, the magical device that reveals what you're capable of. With claws snapping into place, he pressed his hand to the crystal, and it erupted in blazing, sparkling light, so unreal it felt ripped straight out of a fantasy novel. He stared as his skills, idle sleep and swordsmanship, flashed into the air, but only their names appeared while his actual skill book stayed buried and unseen. Suddenly, the cardinals keeled over, choking and gasping as they grabbed at his throat, while the claws stared in stunned confusion, blurting out, "What's happening to the old man? Are you okay?" Because nobody saw this twist coming. The Duke and the cardinal froze in total disbelief, faces twisting with pure shock as they blurted that two skills had appeared, and Claus, crushed by their reaction, felt terror spike through his body. Still reeling from his shock, the cardinal finally admitted that yeah, it happens sometimes. But almost nobody can pull off two skills, which made Klaus's case feel wildly off the charts. Then he threw out the wild claim that Klaus was chosen by God, and right there, while everyone in the house staff and acolytes stared, Klaus panicked inside, cursing himself for not hiding that lazy sleep skill. Cardinal Naruka, hand lifted, urged Duke Garam Muller to seal away the news of Klaus's two skills from the Pope, worried it'd drag the poor kid into a brutal power struggle. Then Klaus, hearing Pope in the air, snapped into a shocked, startled stare. The cardinal hooked a hand on Klaus's shoulder and fired up the bar of his expectations, and even as Klaus struggled to catch up, he realized, right in his gut, that this whole situation was way bigger than he ever thought. Moments later, the butler stepped in and declared he'd escort the cardinal straight to his carriage, and the cardinal, surrounded by his acolytes who bowed with total respect, said goodbye to Klaus and the Duke before riding off. As the grand doors slammed shut behind the departing cardinal, the whole room fell death quiet, leaving the Duke stranded with nothing but his claws. Just then, Scholar Elise burst into the room with her arms wide, shouting that Klaus's arrival couldn't be more perfect. Right on time. She started taking measurements, like she had an invisible weight scale in hand, probably gauging the Duke, while Klaus stared in shock and the Duke let out a furious, exasperated sigh. She leaned in so close it felt suffocating, her face hovering just inches from his claws as she declared, with chilling finality, that her job was done. Still way too close for comfort, she grilled him about his glasses, calling them fake, and he stammered hard, pushing back as if she'd just crashed into his personal space. The Duke watched the exchange unfold and fired off a question about how Elise planned to mass-produce and hand out her research item, and when she said she'd scale it up if the first test came back clean, his claws were still a little shaky. Then he steadied himself, thanked her for the update, and couldn't wait to test it on the spot. Now totally locked in, he mapped out his move. First he hunted down details, piecing together how the distribution and mass production actually worked. Then he tore through the city to dig up more answers and seal his strategy. The Duke leaned in and told Klaus, Elise, and Latte that the kingdom's founding festival was just 1 week away. And he pushed hard that this was the perfect window for Klaus to hit the city, since the huge crowds would hand him the research he needed. Klaus's eyes went wide with pure excitement, and he snapped into enthusiastic agreement. A week later, he got swept up in the kingdom's founding festival, where the whole Garluka kingdom exploded with celebration, streets packed, confetti raining, decorations everywhere, and Captain Mukai watched it all unfold, claws and latte in hand, as the night roared with joy. As they pushed deeper through the roaring marketplace, Klaus got snagged by every weird stall in sight. One merchant shouting about blood rabbit soup, another begging him to try sizzling work skewers, and the wide-eyed kid couldn't help asking if monster meat like that was really safe to eat. He went on to say that if you couldn't fight, stepping outside the city was a death trap, so you needed adventurers to escort you or wipe out monsters. Claus still couldn't stop thinking about monster meat. Then asked Mukai straight up if it really was, and Mukai confirmed it was, hunted near the forest outside the city. The young boy suddenly snapped back to the memory and blurted, "Wait, I know all about this." He explained that adventurers take quests through the Adventurers Guild in Mukai, and the moment Klaus proved he already knew, everyone stared. Then Mukai asked if Klaus wanted to jump in and become an adventurer too. Then Mukai dropped the bomb. Duke Garum, Klaus's own father, used to crave adventure, roaming far and wide before life caught up. Klaus's mind instantly flashed with a younger Garum, all hunger for the road and wide-open skies. He went on, painting Garum as a born troublemaker back in the day, ditching school left and right just to roam and travel. Until Klaus's grandfather, the family's head then, kept chewing him out for it. Fresh excitement sparked his interest, and he begged to see the Adventurers Guild, so Mukai nodded and let them in, but only for a little while. The second they stepped into the Adventurers Guild, cheers erupted in their faces, shouts, laughter, and mugs clinking non-stop, and the whole place was packed with rough fighters stuffing food and downing drinks like it was a celebration. At the doorway, Claus, Latte, and Mukai just stood there, staring at the chaos. Inside, he locked eyes with a guild staff member who greeted him plainly, but those claws. They looked rattled, like the non-stop intensity of everything around him had just crushed them. That whole experience left a sour knot in his gut, and his mind flashed back to the arcade days from middle school. The exact same creepy vibe, like a delinquent crew was about to roll in. And yeah, he remembered it all too well. He'd even been mugged in a place just like that. Spiky-haired and loud as a thunderclap, a boisterous adventurer stormed in and barked why he was there, raging over what a mere child was doing in that place, while Knight Captain Mukai stood nearby, watching the whole blow-up grow. As the spiky-haired adventurer started going off the rails, Mukai tried to step in, only for a ponytailed adventurer to yank him down fast and snap a warning. Don't come in so casually. Far off, a woman with long, curly red hair just sipped her drink and watched it all explode. But right when Mukai was about to jump in, Klaus snapped a firm grip on him and ordered him to wait. He said this face-off was the perfect chance to measure his own power. Then Klaus's steel resolve caught Mukai off guard, and Mukai scrambled to talk him out of it, reminding him what he could do and begging him to hand this mess over to him. Before he even met the spiky-haired adventurer, the man sneered at Mukai, snapping that a kid had no business squaring up with him. Yet the claws just stood his ground, saying he wouldn't pull a single punch, eyes locked and resolve unshaken. Right when the tension hit maximum, a fresh figure burst into view and stepped straight between Klaus and the hostile adventurer, turning the whole clash on its head. It was the woman with the long, curly red hair, and the moment she arrived, her unstoppable authority forced everyone to back off, freezing the conflict before it even started. Amira, the blazing swordswoman, fiery red hair blazing like a warning, stalked into the training hall, and every eye snapped to her. Inside, Klaus was trading hard blows with a tough, battle-worn adventurer. As the sparring dragged on, Amira watched the kid's strikes get wilder by the second, thinking that if he kept swinging like this, he'd be done for before he ever got to say his final words. Yet the tough adventurer snapped that she should mind her own business, because the boy didn't know the first thing about pulling his punches. Klaus, still young but suddenly razor-sharp, felt the truth hit him as Amira spoke. Because if he'd swung at that adventurer with the same wild power he used on Mukai, he could have accidentally killed him. Right when the rugged adventurer was about to strike again, he swore he'd never lose to a mere brat. Then Amira surged in fast, landed a sharp, decisive hit, sent him stumbling back and crushed his bragging silence. Amira snapped her gaze to the stunned adventurer and coolly offered to take him on herself, even daring him to prove whether he really wanted to push his limits. Then her claws flashed, and Klaus jolted, realizing she was an S-rank adventurer, so confused he couldn't figure out why she'd bother helping him, especially when he was convinced the poor guy would be killed if he stepped into a fight with her. Then she turned to Klaus and laid it all out, telling him he had the guts to stay calm around adults, plain and simple. After that, she shrugged and said it was nothing mystical, just a woman's intuition guiding her. Klaus stared at her confused like, wait, intuition. Leaning in, Amira pressed close and brushed Klaus' face with a soft touch, her eyes burning as she said he had something truly special. Amira flashed a confident gesture at the distant blonde woman, Luna, saying she was barring the gym, then snapped her gaze to the claws and told him to follow. While he just stood there, stunned, trying to figure out what special she thought he had. He snapped back in shock when Luna, the guild staff, scolded Amira for that send someone halfway to heaven comment, warning that if she ever dumped someone in that state again, Luna would bill Amira for the treatment and tack the whole cost onto her tab. Moments later, they burst into a massive training room, basically a dojo on steroids, packed with curious onlookers, and the whole air crackled with raw anticipation. An adventure-playing referee shoved a wooden sword into Klaus's hands and declared, "Yep, this is the real training ground." Then told him they'd only spar once and be done, and Klaus practically bounced with excitement and agreed. The training facility was roaring with energy. Adventurers packed along the walls in a long, impatient line, all itching to see the sparring match about to start. Klaus finally understood why the crowd was so huge. Every eye was on him, turning his life into a live spectacle, and then he caught the betting going on around him, with most people throwing their money behind Amira. The referee flashed a copper coin and swore the bout would kick off the instant it dropped, while Amira stood poised and confident, ready to explode into action. As that coin finally dropped, Amira exploded forward like a rocket, and Klaus barely even caught the motion. Only then did he realize just how impossibly fast she was. Amira's strikes came like a blur, but Klaus snapped out of his shock and fought back. He dodged every hit with sharper, faster moves, thanks to the weight he'd just lost. Still, Amira's patience ran out, and she barked at him to stop juking around and face her head-on. She kept hammering with brutal force, snapping her claws out of the way over and over, while the referee stared, locked in. Amira's devastating strikes finally shattered his balance, knocked him flat, and flung him crashing across the room. Even after being blasted across the room, those claws still ripped in with a brutal, sudden strike. An impact so loud it tore through the training room like a shockwave, knocking a bunch of spectators off their feet as they screamed in shock and pain. He stood right in the middle of the disaster he caused, and the training hall was packed with scattered adventurers. Some were groaning on the floor, while others hauled themselves up, dazed by the sudden shockwave. Luna clung to her sword and checked him over, and he insisted he was fine, but another adventurer snapped back, demanding he speak for himself. When the dust finally cleared, the other adventurers crawled back to their feet, one of them staring at Amira like, "That kick had insane power, S-rank, just like everyone said." Amira, though, only kept her eyes on the claws, her face giving nothing away. She didn't look impressed at all, his uncontrolled outburst just annoyed her, and she snapped at him to use his ability properly. He was baffled and asked what she meant, but she only scoffed and made it clear their sparring match wasn't anywhere near finished. Then she spilled the truth. She had a blazing firepower ability that people dubbed her the Blazing Swordswoman. And she said with total confidence that her instincts never miss, meaning she was already clocking that he'd been hiding power too. Now he finally gets what she's demanding, so he clenches his wooden sword tight and fires back with a fierce, determined look. He's going all out. As her aura flared and flames whipped around her, he clamped down on his own resolve. He knew her strength was massive enough to take everything he threw, so he cracked open and unleashed his power to the very limit. Then she exploded forward at blistering speed, blazing through the air like a comet and instantly closing the gap between them. She whirled through the air like a living storm, a blur of speed as her sword screamed in a brutal arc, burning with sheer destructive power. Her blade kept screaming through the air, blazing and unrelenting, proving every second how unstoppable her power truly was. With a deafening roar, her blazing sword slammed into his wooden wand in a total cataclysm, the shockwaves blasting the air as he staggered hard, face twisting in a frantic fight to survive her unstoppable power. His overwhelming power exploded outward, ripping a swirling vortex of energy across the training grounds and blasting shockwaves in every direction, while the crowd got shoved back, faces locked in pure awe and gut-punch terror, as his full force and Amira's blazing skill collided at their absolute peak. Amid the swirling dust and crackling energy, Amira heard her name screamed from the facility entrance, and the second she turned, her fierce focus snapped into sharp worry. Luna, one of the staff, rocked through the doors, panic blazing across her face, and shouted that fresh info just dropped on a recent case, turning everything into an urgent, can't-wait situation. Amira shot Klaus an instant apology, insisting it looked like she'd been the one putting in the work. Then before he could even process it, she slipped right past him, her exit sharp, sudden, and final. Then she pumped up her party, these battle-hardened adventurers, with a thunderous shout demanding they move out right now. Every face snapped into focus, brimming with grit for whatever brutal challenge came next. Flaws watched them vanish and tracked Amira's crew, the Golden Doom Brigade, like it was a headline come to life, and yeah, he couldn't lie, the name was a little dramatic, but it somehow still worked. After Amira slipped out, he blurted that he wanted to fight monsters too, instantly setting off a hulking trainer who rushed in to talk him out of it. Amira, hearing every word, snapped that yeah, when she said work, she meant battling monsters. Laws leaned in, practically vibrating with excitement, and asked if he could register as an adventurer. The guild staff shot back that she couldn't sign up anyone who wasn't already an adventurer, so Laws demanded to know how he was supposed to register. Then he jabbed his name onto the form with reckless enthusiasm, using a nearby adventurer's back as an impromptu table. The trainer stepped in fast, saying Klaus couldn't register without a guardian's okay, and Klaus clutched the form and looked up pleadingly, praying the answer would be yes. Fresh Anna, the maid, nodded along with the trainer, confirming he'd nailed it. Then the trainer turned to the adventurer who'd been serving as a table and started tickling him, and the guy burst into a shocked laugh. After that, the trainer promised Klaus, "You helped us, so we're heading home for the day." He watched Amira vanish, her voice bouncing off the walls with that laid-back goodbye, "See you later, kid." Then Anna, like clockwork, leaned in and reminded him that Latte was set to swing by the very next day. He waved goodbye to Amira and called out, "See you around, Amira." Then she spun back with a teasing wink and said, "Klasama, just kid is totally fine with me," before vanishing from sight. As Amira slipped away, the other adventurers started whispering in a rush, faces going from bored to shocked in seconds, because they finally clocked who he was, the rumored kid from the Duke Muller family, and they couldn't believe it. When they finally learned who he was, the whole air snapped into a new mood. Those smug adventurers dropped to their knees like their courage vanished, and even fear crawled into their smiles. One guild staff member knelt beside the papers, banging out the paperwork, while Walate arrived and just stared, utterly baffled, at what he'd walked into. Between the fallen bodies, two adventurers, one with blazing red hair and the other with spiky hair, were shaking in fear, screaming that they were about to be executed as they begged for forgiveness for their earlier arrogance. He tried to steady the panicked adventurers, chanting over and over that they wouldn't be executed, his hands shaking with desperate gestures as fear crashed around them. Later, he faced the guild staff member, winked like they were in on a secret, and demanded total secrecy for his visit. Then the staffer, fully clued in now, enthusiastically nodded and agreed. That night, deep inside the calm, grand Muller mansion, he crashed into sleep in his bed, smiling like he'd won something, already reliving the day's chaos in his dreams and loving every second of it. While he slept, his dreams snapped sideways and shoved him into a shadowy, otherworldly void, where a haunting song wrapped around him, crooning about sleep, dark nights, peaceful forests, and getting lost in the abyss. And the moment he recognized that melody, dread hit like lightning as he realized something was trying to swallow him whole. The dream surged harder and harder, the melody turning into a cursed chant that screamed of wandering past the shadows, until he spotted a tiny, shadowy, childlike figure, and then a taller, slender woman cloaked in darkness who suddenly let out a sharp, terrifying warning. "Watch out!" He jerked awake, breath snagging in his throat, and that nightmare terror clung to him like a stain, some shadowy figure diving into an abyss, while a scream of pure despair tore through the dark. He couldn't shake the thought that it might have been real, because his mind kept replaying one name from the dream, Latte, like it was a warning, and the question wouldn't let go. What did that horrifying vision really mean? The whole world whirled as the young claws shot out, and the shadow of a girl, Latte, slipped from his grip and dropped into an abyss, right in front of him, feeding the anxiety in his chest as the same cursed vision kept stalking his every waking thought. He snapped awake with terror in his eyes, swearing it was just a nightmare, until Latte's silhouette burned into his mind and slammed his chest with dread and a nasty premonition. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Maid Anna tore through the rooms, shouting for his name as panic clawed at her chest. Then another servant sprinted by and swore he hadn't seen him. Anna's mind snapped to earlier. She'd handed him biscuits, he'd said he was going to read in the garden, and ever since then nobody had spotted him. The search went into overdrive. Then a stable hand barreled toward Sir Aus, yelling that Klaus's horse had vanished from the stable. Sir Aus, clearly worried, demanded to know if Klaus had slipped out on his own. Then the stable hand rushed in with a book and said it was the exact one Klaus had been reading, left sitting in the horse's spot. Miles from the estate, Klaus barreled through the wild landscape, and a quiet apology churned in his head for vanishing without a single word. He pressed on, thinking, if Latte's stuck to her usual routine, I'm going to catch her right at the edge of the forest. He hit the meeting spot and swept his eyes across the area. Then disappointment sank in like a punch because she wasn't there. Even though the village stops right here and monsters wait beyond the edge, Claus gritted his teeth and pushed on anyway, because he couldn't shake the gut feeling that Latte had met something awful in the forest, and her shadow flashed in his thoughts again. He kept pushing forward, bouncing along for an entire hour through the thick forest, his mind racing as he tried to figure out which road to take next. Suddenly, he ran straight into a band of worn-out horsemen, led by a stunning red-haired woman. She introduced herself as Amira, part of the Fume Brigade, the crew everyone feared because they hunted monsters. He blurted out in shock, asking if she'd really been working since yesterday. She nodded, saying her whole group had been grinding through the night, wiped out by the effort, and was finally on her way home. And then she fired back, wondering why he was there. She told us that right up this road, 3 merchant wagons were slammed and destroyed by a monster horde, and her crew spent the whole night cutting them down, but one lousy orc still slipped away. She leaned in and asked if he'd seen a noble's carriage slip by. He shook his head, saying no. Then she yawned and said they had to sleep, heading back into the city to restock, and he thanked them for all their hard work. Exhausted like her, the rest of her brigade vouched for it. Authorities had shut the road down since that morning to dig into the incident. He suddenly realized he couldn't keep marching down that same road. Then Amira watched his struggle and tossed him another way forward. She jutted her finger toward those far-off mountain peaks and told him he could swing around by taking the path beside the Zazinia range. Then he mouthed the name again, and a spark of recognition flashed in his eyes. A cold memory hit him like a punch. There was a stampede raging in the Zazinia mountains, and his breath caught as the truth slammed in. Amira saw his panic and demanded, "What's wrong?" He suddenly snapped everything into place. Those monster sightings weren't random, they were tied to the stampede. Then he blurted that he had to leave right now and started to bolt. But Amira's heart raced as she shouted for him to wait, swearing she'd go with him. She scrubbed the grime off his claws, panic written all over his face, and she snapped orders at the monster hunters. "Call the guards right now and get back to where they were." Meanwhile, Amira didn't waste a second. She snapped her horse awake and shoved it forward. "Hey, wake up, come on, let's go," she barked, ready to ride out. As Amira kicked her horse into a sprint, she shouted at Klaus to hold back and not do anything reckless. She needed to catch up first. But Klaus froze, swallowed by a cold, sudden memory. Latte, the girl from the wheelchair in the game, had once been hurt in a stampede in the Zazinia Mountains when she was little, and it left her unable to walk. He kept tearing forward on his frantic ride, the sun blazing overhead, noon already, and hours had melted by in a non-stop blur of riding and trotting with barely any breathers. Then a chilling thought hit him hard. Was this stampede about to replay that same deadly incident? The distance they'd crushed through wouldn't leave his head. He'd figured it was over 30 kilometers, a trip that'd take just an hour on modern transport, basically the same as looping the whole Yamanote line from his place. Even with his body screaming in exhaustion, he shoved the horse forward, knowing every step was pushing past its breaking point, because his own muscles were already burning from the non-stop ride. And that's when his resolve hardened. He wasn't letting the game's tragic end happen on his watch, not if it meant saving Latte at any cost. His desperate sprint got slammed to a stop when the path ahead turned into a total dead end, completely blocked. And that was the loudest warning of all. The chaos up ahead was already in full swing. No hesitation, he jumped down from the saddle, told his horse to hold right there, and the moment the animal sensed the urgency, it answered like it truly understood, as if thanking him for the rush. Then he pushed forward on foot, eyes bulging in pure disbelief, because the whole carriage had been torn and dragged straight into the heart of the forest. He stood on the ravaged path's edge, staring into those pitch-dark woods like they were the mouth of an abyss. He dropped to one knee, stared at the ground, spotted a clear footprint, and bam, everything clicked. With a worried face, he choked out Latte's name. From the wreckage, he guessed the passengers had leaped out of the carriage before it tore off the road, then vanished into the thick forest. Back on the horse's saddle, he leaned in and asked, "Did you hear anything?" He figured horses could pick up sounds better than most, strong hearing, just not as razor-sharp as dogs. He jabbed his finger toward the forest, guessing Latte was somewhere within a 4-kilometer stretch that way since horses can pick up sounds that far. Then he grimly acknowledged the brutal truth. Going in alone was pure danger. But he couldn't just sit there and wait. His resolve snapped into place, and he swore he wouldn't hang around any longer because he was ready to move. He snapped a map open, drew sharp marks across it, then grabbed a handful of tiny round treats, tossing one to the horse first as it munched happily, then he ate his share right after. With his preparations finally locked in, he felt that sharp, unstoppable readiness settle in. Everything was in place, exactly as it should be. Then he swung back to the horse, calm and confident, telling it, no worries, that its wild instinct would guide it straight back home. He slapped the horse's flank hard, then barked, "Go bring Amira to me." As the horse tore away, he stood at the forest's edge, stared up through the thick trees, and wondered which one would give him the perfect spot to climb. He fought his way up the tree, bare feet slipping on the rough bark, so he wrapped cloth around his hand and clenched his teeth through the grind. Climbing turned into a nightmare way worse than he expected. He wiped sweat off his brow as his breaths came out in ragged bursts, tried prying the rock with a fallen branch like a lever, but it snapped under him, and he slammed back into the forest floor. He stood at the edge of the dense woods, staring up at a looming wall of leaves, and he knew he had to push in further into the unknown. He looked up and the forest ceiling slammed into view, so thick with leaves it swallowed the sky and turned daylight into endless twilight, while he shoved through the undergrowth, rage and frustration boiling in his chest. All at once the earth crumbled under his feet, and he spilled down a brutal slope, screaming as his grip failed and his stick went flying. Then it hit him. He could only recall the horses within a 1 kilometer range, and the distance was way too huge. He kept plunging downward, and the brutal terrain tore his plans apart. He'd totally misjudged just how wild and unstoppable nature really was. Even as everything crashed down and exhaustion chewed at him, he clung to his stick with fierce grip, eyes blazing with fresh resolve. No way was he surrendering. He shoved onward through the tangled undergrowth, fully convinced he hadn't lost the right path. His eyes locked onto something half hidden by the leaves, and in a flash everything clicked. Pure shock hit him hard. There, half swallowed by leaves and dirt, was Latte's shoe. He gripped that mud-splattered shoe like it might bite, and dread crashed over him the second he recognized it. No, it can't be, he gasped, eyes blazing, so he snapped his gaze around, jaw set, and made up his mind. Meanwhile, Latte sprawls on the forest floor, slowly twitching as if she's barely holding on. She dragged herself upright, a brutal throbbing pounding in her skull, and called out in a shaky voice, asking if everyone was okay. A horrifying thought slammed into her, and she gasped, then stumbled backward, trembling with pure terror. Fry was still sprawled on the ground, and panic hit her hard as she screamed for help, anyone at all, until her voice barely carried through the thick, haunted woods. She tried to push herself up, but her legs buckled, and she crashed down again, panic surging as she frantically wondered where to go, knowing she had to shout for help. Exhausted and trembling with tears, she collapsed there and pleaded in a near-silent whisper for help, begging that anyone would finally hear her. Even with despair clawing at her, she forced herself back up, trudged through the thick undergrowth, and kept shouting for someone. Far away, Klaus gripped Lot's shoe like it was his last lifeline, his resolve rock steady as he quietly begged the world to keep her safe, because giving up hope this soon was impossible. Little did he know, Latte's situation had spiraled into something way more dangerous. A huge, ominous shadow hung over her, and pure terror shook her to the core. Meanwhile, Klaus clutched that shoe like it was a lifeline and swore he'd find her no matter what, totally unaware of the danger closing in on her right now. Latte, a young girl, snapped her head back in panic, eyes bulging as a hulking, shadowy beast swallowed the forest behind her. And then from below, a monstrous grin stretched wide while glowing eyes lit up, as its hand surged with eerie, luminous power crackling in the air. The monstrous figure surged forward and snapped its attack, making Latte shriek in pure terror as she stumbled back, while the young boy with the claws stood nearby, staring in stunned disbelief at the nightmare unfolding in front of him. Meanwhile, young Klaus, still reeling from the attack, sprinted through the forest with his jaw set, sword hammering at his back as he charged straight toward the danger. Elsewhere, the warrior Amira reined her horse beside another armored fighter and finally slowed to a stop, then glanced back with a sharp, subtle change in her face like she'd felt trouble creeping somewhere out in the distance. Deeper in the forest, Latte kept tearing through the trees on a desperate sprint, panting like her lungs would burst, while a monstrous orc shaman barreled after her with brutal, unstoppable strides that never slowed. She stumbled hard, lost her footing, and slid into a steep slope packed with tangled roots, while the orc shaman stayed right on her heels, looming merciless and ready to strike. Bruised and totally out of it after the fall, Latte crumpled on the forest floor and thrashed through the thick undergrowth, fighting to snap back into her bearings. She clawed for shelter under the twisted roots of a towering tree, until the orc shaman's huge, grotesque hand shot in and snared her, glowing eyes locked on her as she let out another scream of pure terror. She screamed as the monstrous orc shaman lunged at her, that cruel, menacing grin locked on its face, and its massive body swallowing the light with a terrifying shadow. As she scrabbled to crawl away in pure panic, an enormous orc hand lunged out of the dark, massive fingers snapping shut on her, and the young girl screamed, refusing to be taken. He grabbed her by the head and hoisted her into the air like she weighed nothing, while her terrified screams tore through the forest, begging, fighting as her fate closed in. In a brutal blast of power, the orc shaman violently rocketed her through the air, and slammed her hard into the thick, tangled foliage of the surrounding trees. She lay still among scattered leaves, her tiny body unmoving after that brutal hit. Moments later, Klaus tore through the undergrowth and spotted her lying there, and without hesitation he scooped her up, cradling her close. Relief hit him like a flood the second he realized he'd made it in time. Slowly she stirred, her eyelids fluttered open, and with a feeble voice she called his name. He hauled her up and snapped, "Not now, save the tears," because that monstrous orc shaman was still lurking right behind them, dead-center danger. He stared at the thing, instantly clocking it as the same kind of general orc he'd fought in that game, and he couldn't help thinking how badly that game's combat looked, because now he had to wonder if he could pull off the protagonist's one-blow victory in real life. Even with his nerves screaming, he remembered the truth. After his clash with Amira, both his strange skill and his swordsmanship had leveled up, so yeah, hope flickered back in his chest. Renewed fire lit his eyes as he yanked his sword free, locked onto the orc shaman, and swore he'd pour every last drop of himself into the coming battle. He snapped at Latte to dive for cover right now, warning that a red-haired woman was about to show up any second. Latte, still sprawled on the ground, could only manage a shaky little sound. As Latte scurried off, he locked onto the orc shaman and swore he was ready to take on the general orc. Then the monster shaman surged forward, stomping so hard the ground rattled. Latte just gave a quick okay and crawled away. He shot forward in a blur, and that massive creature got rocked by his lightning-fast strike, leaving the orc's shaman stumbling back, stunned by how sudden and ruthless their attack was. But the orc shaman snapped back in a flash and hammered him with a brutal strike, sending him blasting through the air before he smashed into the undergrowth, the whole forest rattling with the impact. He groaned on the ground, every bone screaming from that brutal hit, and then it hit him. The massive creature moved way faster than he ever expected. From a distance, Latte's eyes filled with tears as she shouted his name, desperate, and in that instant he knew this new world would punish one careless second like it was death. The orc shaman barreled forward without mercy, its shadow swallowing him as he grimaced in the dirt, and a chilling truth finally hit. At this pace, he wasn't just losing, he was getting wiped out completely. He fought like hell to push himself up, reaching out with shaking hands, desperate words spilling out as he refused to surrender to fate. Then a ferocious resolve snapped to life inside him. He hauled himself up, eyes blazing with pure determination, and swore, "I'm not dying again." He slipped like lightning under the orc shaman's guard, plotting to slam in from a shockingly low angle and take it down. Staying just out of reach, he circled the orc and aimed to smash its vulnerable tendons, convinced its feet were safe from its sight. Then the monster snapped to attention, read his move, and slammed him with another brutal strike that spun him back and left him staggering, even as he fought to keep his feet. He kept up the relentless onslaught, his blade whipping through the air as he slammed the orc shaman, who staggered back, already reeling from an arm that was clearly badly damaged. Even with the damage staring everyone in the face, the orc shaman still felt untouchable. He grit his teeth. Because his last hit only knocked the monster's right hand aside, it didn't finish it. And then the shaman snapped forward and blasted him with another raging, glowing punch. Down below, the shaman's power fused together in one violent burst, blinding light, roaring smoke, and it left him staring, wide-eyed, frozen in shock. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Latte crashed through the undergrowth, wheezing in ragged gasps as thoughts of claws spiraled in her mind, mourning how he'd come to rescue her, even though she felt like nothing but a burden. She kept hiding, her heart hammering with fear and guilt, while he fought with everything he had. Yet she could only stay hidden, swallowed by a wave of self-reproach, and she finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Back in the clearing, he squared up to the orc's shaman again, caught in that menacing stare like a trap, and cursed how this fight never ends. Wave after wave of brutal attacks crashing down on him. He planted his feet, sword at the ready, as the orc shaman gathered itself for another strike, every breath heavy with anticipation. Right then, from the thick foliage, a brand new beast lunged out, a giant feral wolf with eyes burning like daggers, hungry to tear something apart. And just like that, a fresh threat crashed the moment everyone thought they'd survive. With a sudden jolt, he realized it. He'd been snapped into a pincer attack, boxed in by the relentless orc shaman and the wolf monster that had just slammed into the fight. As both beasts surged in, he clenched his teeth and forced himself to hold out, waiting for the final heartbeat, then firing off a desperate gamble for survival. He snapped into action the moment the wolf monster lunged, claws bared and ready to carve out a deadly hit. The wolf monster's blow missed, yet he caught a brief opening. Then the orc shaman barreled on, still terrifying and relentless, clawing his way forward until he had no choice but to stay on guard. Then it clicked, this was a magic stone, and monsters hid treasures like it. He just learned a brand new skill, non-elemental magic, starting at level 1 with proficiency climbing the more he used it, and at proficiency level 1 it unlocked body strengthening. Even with his brand new power, the orc shaman stayed terrifying, its strength crashing down like a wall and turning every fight into a brutal challenge. He tore into the orc shaman with his brand new non-elemental magic, unleashing a brutal burst of raw power that slammed it down hard and left it defeated on the ground. Standing over the fallen shaman, a steely fire in his eyes ignited. This new skill wasn't just luck, it was his ticket to beating bigger monsters ahead. And since this was a revenge match, he came out on top, powered up like never before. The orc shaman's monstrous shape branded itself into his mind, its horrifying face staring back through the storm of tears in his wide, aching eye. He staggered back onto his feet, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight, and he knew he had to find his sword before the creature snapped back to full awareness. He sprinted through the thick forest, frantically shouting for his lost blade, and right behind him the orc shaman hacked up blood, badly hurt but still seething with rage. A fresh surge of power woke up inside him, but he brushed it off. There was no way he'd drop his sword now. When the daylight started to die and night came creeping in, he gasped in shock and threw something straight into the dark. His momentum yanked him forward, and he slammed down a steep, wild slope, just cursing his bad luck as he tumbled. Bruised, battered, and sprawled on the forest floor, he wondered if the creature was still locked on its meal, because he knew the hunt would kick off again any moment. He finally clocked that the thing he'd seen was a magic stone, and a grim truth hit him like a hammer. His training had only taught swordsmanship, so monsters and magic artifacts were a whole new nightmare, and he couldn't even tell if smashing it would be enough to take down his enemy. Out of the shadows, a familiar silhouette snapped into view, Latte, eyes locked on him as she launched a blood-stained sword through the air. He froze, shouting her name, begging her not to go back to this death trap. He stared in pure disbelief as the orc shaman, bleeding and wrecked by grievous wounds, refused to fall, its body still slick with blood, but its resolve unbroken. Then it roared out a guttural cry and tore forward with terrifying power. Meanwhile, Latte clutched a bloodied sword with her eyes shut tight, praying like her life depended on it, swearing the blade was Vice Captain Genius's and begging it to shield her. Then a gentle glow sparked as she lowered the sword to the ground, blessing Klaus's road ahead while the abyss itself mourned for his noble soul. He dropped to one knee before the sword, clocking Latte's words as a curse stitched into this world, yet somehow still seeing it mirror a protective charm. Then he whipped around to Latte and asked if he could use the sword, and she nodded without hesitation, telling him she'd wanted to fight beside him, but she knew she'd only slow him down. He thanked her with real sincerity, then stepped forward and swore he'd take it from here. Suddenly, he screamed at Latte to bolt, because the orc shaman was on his way, and she snapped into motion, tearing deeper into the forest. As Latte backed away, he dug in and refused to move, sword clutched tight in his grip, eyes locked on the orc shaman as he pushed out of the thick foliage. Wounded and roaring again, the orc shaman surged forward, its eyes blazing with fresh malice as it braced to tear into its next target. He tried to swing that gigantic blade, but it was brutally heavy, screaming that this weapon was built for grown-ups. So he wrenched and struggled just to lift it, his face twisting with pure strain. In the middle of that brutal fight, pure power erupted inside him, and once he triggered his body enhancement skill, his whole form sparked and crackled with raw electrical energy. With that skill kicking in, the sword suddenly felt shockingly light, weight and length alike, like it was nothing more than a golf club, so he swung it around with fresh confidence, a determined grin exploding across his face. He slid across the jagged ground with sharp, calculated control, using every uneven step to get the upper hand. Then he brought the heavy blade down in a brutal arc, aiming straight for the orc shaman to slam it into the earth with a single down blow. The hit landed with a brutal crack, blasting out a fiery burst that yanked the monstrous shaman's sprint to a stop, chunks of its tough hide spraying through the air as it staggered mid-charge. Without breaking stride, he snapped in with a lightning punch shot, smashing the heavy blade into the shaman's leg with ruthless force. With a killer chip shot, he clipped it low, then snapped it up using the creature's own momentum, launching its massive body into the air for a split second before he smashed it upward again. With the orc shaman dangling in midair, he tore into it with a non-stop storm of punches, each hit exploding into shockwaves that kept the battered beast from ever getting its feet back. The shaman slammed into the ground, body mangled and bleeding, but he didn't flinch. He already expected it to fight back, because he knew this thing was built to be brutal. He braced for the decisive strike, vowing to rip the magic stone out before the creature fully bounced back. He just needed one last ounce of power, one final push to end it for good. A brutal spike of pain shot through his body, and he felt his body enhancement skill start to unravel, like the power was fading fast, leaving him exposed for just a few minutes. Just as he tried to react, the orc shaman snapped back in an instant, blasting corrosive fluid straight from its mouth. He barely twisted aside in time to dodge the deadly spray. But the shaman was lightning fast. It surged forward, slammed him down, and pinned him under its brutal weight, grinding him into the dirt as corrosive fluid blasted out non-stop, and his ribs screamed with strain like they were moments from snapping. He hurled himself back into the orc shaman's assault, still soaked in that corrosive slime, and as his left arm got eaten away by acid, it also snapped back to life at terrifying speed, miracle and nightmare in the same breath. He growled under it all, drove forward through the agony, and begged for one more jolt of power to finally break that monster. With one last explosive burst, he ripped a huge chunk of flesh from the orc shaman, and the creature staggered back, roaring in raw agony as it crumpled to the ground, totally spent. Yet even battered and bleeding, a tiny spark of triumph still flooded his chest. Lying flat in the grass, battered to the bone and his left arm still visibly reforming, he forced a trembling, grateful smile. Then he rasped out a quiet thank you to Genius-san, because that help was the only reason he was still alive. As he stared at his arm knitting itself back together, it hit him like a thunderclap. So he muttered a quiet thank you to Latte, finally realizing her help was there all along, even when he couldn't see it. Then he hauled himself up, and his eyes caught a shattered magic stone on the ground. Rage hit him instantly when he realized the skill inside was gone for good. Right when the shock of that loss finally hit, A loud rustle from the bushes signaled Latte was coming. She burst from the trees and shouted his name with panic, demanding to know if he was okay. And when he looked up stunned, he blurted her name right back. She surged toward him, eyes snapping wide at the sight of blood splattered across his clothes, and she demanded to know if it was his. But he shot his hands up fast, waving her off and assuring her it was. Relieved, she burst out with how happy she was that he was safe and reached for a hug. Then he shot up a hand and told her to wait. He admitted he was caked in grime and blood, warning her that if she grabbed him, she'd get stained too, and then he added that his ribs might be broken, making it clear just how badly he was hurt. Even after he warned her, Latte still slipped her hand into his with gentle care, her face screaming pure, unshakable worry. A soft touch landed on his bloodied hand, slicing through the grime and pain that had covered him. She stared at him with tear-filled eyes and reassured him that his condition didn't bother her. She was just bursting with relief that he was safe. And after a quick moment of meeting her eyes, he looked away. As she pushed through the dense forest with him, he could barely squeeze out a plea for just a moment to rest, his exhaustion screaming in every breath. Her worry surged as she shouted his name again, and she felt him slump even harder into her arms. Suddenly his legs crumpled, and he started to plummet, Latte scrambling desperately to break his fall. He lay sprawled in the forest, drained to the bone, while Latte dropped to her knees beside him, her face twisted with pure anguish. She cried out his name, pure desperation spilling from her voice, but he stayed stone cold, refusing to answer. The chronicler stared at the brutal question hanging in the air. What would become of Klaus now that his power was gone and death was creeping in at the edges? Chapter 9 * Pure Guilt * kicks off with Latte dark hair falling over her face, as she stares down like something heavy is crushing her from the inside, while Anastas stands behind her, silent as a ticking truth. Suddenly, two eyes snapped open, staring up at a ceiling blanketed in hair, and the whole room spun as reality hit. Klaus's eyes snapped open, only to find himself trapped in a tangle of sheets while a mirror sat right beside him. Latte knelt at his side, and two other bodies lay unconscious on the floor, turning the whole place into pure chaos. He could only blurt, what is going on? As he took it all in, Latte, face tight with worry, reached for him, murmuring his name like it might save him. Latte. Amira just watched from the side, eyes sharp with a knowing, almost mischievous smile. Moments later, the door blew off its hinges, and Anna stormed in with eyes popping in shock at what she saw. She gasped, screamed, Klaus. Then caught herself, blurted, Klaus-sama, Anna, you're awake. And immediately rushed to cover her mistake, because the situation was suddenly too real. Her shock hit like lightning. She stumbled, toppled hard onto the floor. And Amira, still lounging in bed, watched with a playful smirk, murmuring if he'd finally bounced back, while Klaus only gave a calm little hum. Amira leaned in, teased him by poking his chin, and flashed that sly smile like she knew secrets, saying last night must have been wild. He turned bright red and could only mutter that, yeah, it was a bit of an understatement. Latte and Anna hung there, jaws dropped at Amira's suggestive comments, while Klaus snapped his eyes away, face burning from the whole awkward exchange. He jolted upright, suddenly way fresher and brighter, and chirped a cheerful good morning at them, until his smile vanished as panic hit, because he realized he was totally naked under the sheets, blurting naked. He clawed up, clutching a ripped scrap of clothing, and blurted out 1,000 apologies for ruining his look, calling it a miserable mess, while Anna wore guilt on her face and admitted she had brought spare clothes, only for them to have been used by Lady Latte, leaving Klaus staring, reeling at what that meant. He caught himself staring at Latte, now rocking his wolf shirt like she'd been wearing it all along, only to look down, cheeks burning, when Anna the maid asked what was going on. Right then Sir Aus slammed into the room, frozen with shock, blurted Klaus's name, and trotted in with a fresh loaf of bread and a big stack of neatly folded clothes. Sir Aus finally exhaled in relief when Klaus was back on his feet, then explained he'd rushed to the nearby market to buy commoner clothes, and even apologized for how plain they looked. Klaus just smiled and told him it was totally fine. As he started to change into the new clothes, Latte and Anna rushed in to help him squeeze into the simple garments, and guilt hit him hard when he realized he'd dragged everyone into all this trouble. Right after that, everyone huddled together with warm drinks in hand, while Amira lounged and stretched, Klaus, Latte, and the warriors settled in as Anna walked over, handing them cups of tea. Latte slid him a cup, and he snatched it with a grateful grin, while Anna watched Latte like she was trying to solve a mystery. Sir Oz leaned in and broke everything down for Klaus, then hit him with the wild truth that he'd slept through an entire day. He also confessed they'd borrowed a commoner's house nearby just so they could make do with the only bed, like that detail was dragging his shoulders down, while in the background Amira was hauling a wounded warrior to safety. Amira caught the conversation, smirked, and muttered that it was a nightmare they'd all ended up stuck in that compromising mess, while Latte at the same time politely thanked her Aus for the tea. Sir Aus didn't hold back. He revealed that the Golden Destruction Brigade and the police were hunting them down, so they had no choice but to bolt and hide in this lonely hideout, while in the back, Amira, Latte, and Klaus huddled together, resting in the same bed. Sir Aus slapped the news down, the road to the archive territory was finally open, and Captain Amakai was back. Klaus practically lit up with relief while Amira, fully ready now, swore she was leaving at once because reporting to the guild couldn't wait. Right before she left, the knight captain bowed so deeply it looked like he'd collapse, thanking her from the bottom of his heart and saying the guild would take care of her reward. She cut him off with one simple command: wait. Moments later that same night, the captain sat down with Klaus and Latte, laid out the plan. Some of the Knight Order would stay behind to guard the surrounding area, and then turned and invited Latte to come with them. As departure drew close, Klaus dropped to one knee by Latte, asking if she could stand. She waved him off, insisting she was fine and pushing him to get into the carriage. Latte couldn't even stand, so Sarah scooped her up and carried her like she weighed nothing. While Klaus bowed and thanked the house for the use of it, and the knight captain slipped a bag of payment to the stable hand who couldn't stop smiling. With everything ready, the stable hand shot them a farewell wave, and the carriage guarded by the knight captain and his crew lurched into motion, then vanished into the dark road ahead. The horses trotted on, hauling the gorgeous carriage down the road while the knight captain kept pace beside it, eyes sharp and vigilant as the darkness rolled in. Inside the rattling carriage, Klaus leaned toward the window and stared out, his eyes full of deep, serious thoughts as the world blurred past. Later, in a cozy room, Anna and Latte curled up and fell asleep side by side on a big bed, calm as can be, while Klaus and Sir Eus lingered nearby, watching in quiet silence. As the night dragged on, Sir Eus practically begged Klaus to rest, but Klaus snapped back that he was fine, even as a dull, lingering pain still haunted his internal injuries, and Sir Eus couldn't believe how fast he'd bounced back from damage that had looked utterly severe. He stared at his claws, shocked by how wild his healing was, and finally understood it. His sleep skill was legit. Crank out enough rest and it grows, so at level 1 he can finally sink into cozy recovery, level 2 lets him gulp down massive energy, and by level 3 his body heals on its own naturally. He was still trying to process his lightning-fast recovery when Anna, tears pouring down her face, demanded that every last drop of medicine be for him. And standing right there, Sir Aus stayed stone calm as she insisted she didn't need any for herself. Even with Anna's protests ringing in the air, it became obvious. Klaus's treatment had been the right move, because Latte's legs still sat wrapped in heavy bandages, while Klaus was already healing fast. Inside the carriage, he leaned toward the window to watch the world slide by, while Latte sat perfectly still with her eyes locked on the floor. Then Sir Es noticed and urged her to rest, because they were clearly headed straight for Mackay. The carriage kept rolling down the tree-lined path, Knight Captain and the other riders riding shotgun, pushing forward like nothing could stop it. Later on, he found himself on horseback beside the Knight Captain, who bragged that riding felt way comfier than the carriage. And then he asked Klaus if he wanted to talk about Mackay. Klaus shot back that yes, he did. He stared down and shame hit him like a wave, so fast it made him feel totally, painfully foolish. He replayed his earlier swagger, how he'd shouted that he wanted to fight monsters. But the moment he remembered the orc shaman's terrifying presence, his courage crumpled and he flinched, because real battle was way uglier than he'd ever imagined. It felt like life and death in that moment, and the truth hit him so hard it weighed on his chest. The Knight Captain calmly patted his head, because this kid had slipped out alone and wrecked everyone's night. That night the captain kept patting his head, praising him for surviving his first real battle without getting caught by a general orc, something to hold high with pride. Then said his family felt the same, apologized for treating him like a kid, and Claus finally looked up, stunned by the sudden warmth. He replayed those words in his head, and then it hit him hard. Mackay's father was the same age as him. In this made-up past, he pictured another life, one where he'd have been the kind of great teammate the man in front of him deserved. The man softly stroked his head, and in that younger version of himself a quiet hope flared, just one more touch of that comfort. His wish came true in the most dramatic way. He yanked his own hair back with full force and the man squeaked, "Hey, don't do that, I'll end up bald." Moments later, the memory slipped away the second he was safely back home, where the Knight Captain and Sir House were waiting. Then the captain told him to crash and rest, said he'd report to Garum, and had Anna call a doctor for Latte. A few days flew by. Sir Eus marched straight to the king, while Mukai drove the Knight Order into the Airing territory. At the same time, Amira and the rest of the guild were out doing their own missions, full throttle. He stood at the window, pacing through the chaos in his head, sure the stampede would be shoved back before it turned into something massive. Then he prayed that the sealed road would reopen fast, so he could finally deliver Latte back to her parents. He patted his waist and grinned. He was fully back to normal. But then he frowned, wondering if that sleep somehow packed on a little extra weight. Then his face twisted into real worry, like some new, urgent problem was crushing down on his thoughts. The real trouble was Latte. He watched from the doorway as Anna tried to coax her into eating, her voice pushing that she needed to eat more because Latte's safety was on his mind. Yet Latte, still bundled in her blanket, looked more distressed than ever. Still crushed by what happened, Latte stayed buried under a blanket, shutting herself in and refusing food. Anna, loyal to the end, hauled over a meal and whispered a gentle apology for not doing more. Latte could only choke out guilt. She couldn't bear to look Master Klaus in the eye, not after everything that blew up. Ever since they came back to the mansion, she'd vanished behind her own walls, forcing Klaus to stand outside her closed door, praying he'd find a way to reach her and melt the frozen grip around her heart. For several days, Latte shut down and kept to herself, and while Klaus buried himself in desk work, his mind kept snapping back to her. Because that soft, gentle heart of hers could only mean one thing: she was hurting badly. With worry chewing at his nerves, he pressed his ear to her door, hunting for even the faintest sound inside. Then bam, the door exploded open, and Latte stood there looking shocked that he was right in front of her. He shot back with a quick question about her health, and she admitted her appetite still wouldn't come back. Then she confessed she had no spare clothes, so she was stuck in a maid's uniform right now, and Klaus blurted out in pure shock. Suddenly, his mind sprinted into a wild, perfect fantasy. Latte in a maid's uniform, pigtails bouncing, a frilly apron swishing as she served him a meal and flashed him a charming smile. Snapping back to reality, Klaus shot out that he had to grab Latte new clothes, and he realized he actually had the savings to do it. Right then, the butler showed up with the news that the night order sent into the Uling territory came back safe and sound, and that Chairman Merkai's appointment for tomorrow was still locked in, so Klaus could only stare and think tomorrow was already here just like that. Then he spun to Latte and told her he was heading into town tomorrow for a business talk. Right after that, he asked her to help him pick out new clothes. Latte didn't hesitate, she practically lit up, her mood jumping sky high. The next day, that bustling town square exploded with life. Shops flicked open their lights and stalls lined up like they were about to launch. Right as they reached the shop, Ruin, representative of the Looney Trading Company's second branch, stepped out to greet Klaus, bragging that it was her push with product development alongside Eldisha, a scholar that earned this place as their business partner. Then she smirked and said Klaus looked nothing like she'd heard, and Klaus just shrugged, saying he's constantly told that. He froze when a little boy showed up and dropped off a letter. His face twisted between shock and total confusion, while Ruin just stood there, calm as ever, right beside him. He stared at the letter, still in shock, while Ruin said it was from Garam and that it mentioned Eldisha. Meanwhile, the boy looked like he was falling apart. Ruin snapped that she'd been prepping for tomorrow and had to vanish right now, shocking him to the core. Then added that Eldisha would be watching and setting up something today and again tomorrow. She held up a document for a brand new product, a weight scale, and even though the name was plain, she knew that simplicity hit hard. He grinned, shocked by how smoothly everything rolled, and thanked Ruin when the company confirmed they received the installation plan and contract, while a clerk nearby kept stamping and shuffling the paperwork without missing a beat. He dropped his gaze, wore a grim face, and apologized, telling her he couldn't play the child against his lord's wishes, then begging her to keep granting him her kindness. Ruin pushed the idea that they should mount the weight scales in public facilities first, watch how people reacted, and only then think about selling them one by one. Then she got ready to inspect the very first site, but he snapped up a hand and demanded an answer to a question. Then she leaned in and asked if he knew a great place to buy clothes for a girl, telling him the store next door was run by their company too, and urged him to go check it out. Later, in the clothing store, he froze in front of the mirror, eyes wide in total shock, while Latte held up the maid uniform and told him it was an existing product, then added that their heights were basically the same. Then he stared at the clothes rack and told Latte to swap into a different dress, while another maid, Anna, held one up and nodded, confirming it fit perfectly. He clocked Anna in her gorgeous, ornate dress and praised it as if it was made for her. Then Anna's face lit up like she couldn't believe it. He started to think about grabbing a dress for Latte too, but Anna quickly reminded him Latte's outfit was already absurdly pricey, and that hit him like a cold splash of reality. A gift that grand could totally overwhelm her. While he kept staring into his own thoughts, he suddenly snapped that the dress was meant for his private maid, and that if she had any real feelings, she'd put it on. Then his eyes bulged in surprise when she fired back, asking whether that was just sexual harassment. Later, back at the shop, Ruin shoved a brand new dress design in front of him and pitched it as the next option. Then his eyes widened as he stared at the detailed sketch, stunned. He voiced his worries, asking if this was way too soon for a design like that. Then Ruin shot back that the size could be tweaked later if the wearer grew, proving it would stay worth it. So he reluctantly nodded and told her to go ahead and place the order. His mind sprinted, snapping one clue to another. The new dress, the game he knew like his own name, and then it hit him. This dress was showing up way too early, far ahead of the timeline it was supposed to follow, and that cold thought slammed into his chest. Was the game's story changing right now? Ruin thrust a letter into his hands and demanded to know if he'd read Garam's message, because he hadn't planned to yet. Then she revealed the dress would be finished next month, and he could grab it at the main store in the royal capital. As he tore into the letter, warm praise poured out, celebrating his recent wins and calling him the pride of the Miller family. But then, out of nowhere, Garam's warped, raging face burst into his thoughts, and dread sank deep into his chest. Ruin watched his face and teased him to no end, firing questions about what was going on in the royal capital, and whether he'd heard about that surprise tea party Garam mentioned. Then she leaned in and asked if he wanted a spoiler. He snapped back fast, saying he was a merchant who actually valued information and wouldn't risk getting it spoiled. And Ruin just smirked, shushed him like she already knew way more than she was letting on. Right outside the store, Ruin, Anna, and he climbed into a waiting carriage as a coachman stood by, and Ruin leaned in to remind him. His next job was to inspect the site where the weight scale was going in. Then he slipped away from the coachman, thanking him for getting them back so early, and the coachman, grinning, waved right back. He planted himself in front of a looming stone wall, the gateway to the Miller Knights training facility, while the butler told them this was their very first stop, and Ruin and the young boy followed close, staring up at the massive entrance. The butler scooped up the young boy and hauled him toward the top of that towering wall, asking if he could spot what was inside. But the kid immediately wobbled at the height and begged to be set down. Inside the facility, the butler swung around and clapped Klaus on the back, grinning like he'd just witnessed greatness, then loudly told the knights all around that Lord Klaus had arrived to push them forward, while Klaus, still a little mortified by the huge fanfare, gave a small, polite greeting. The knights froze at the announcement, then burst into chaos, half of them shouting Lord Klaus, in pure awe, and the other half staring in confusion like, wait, did he get fat? The butler shot in right away and cleared everything up. Lord Klaus had come to reward them with a special bonus for their work in the Stampede mission. So the knights dropped into a bow, flooding him with thanks, and the butler winked at Klaus with a knowing grin. Klaus watched their reactions and realized it all. His father had placed him in this role, and now he could feel the truth. He wasn't alone, he was backed by everyone around him. While the knights caught their breath from training, they still kept grinding. Some stretched their muscles, others chugged water, until the butler stepped in and made it clear. The knights who were left behind were still training even during their leave. Suddenly, the knights started flexing and striking poses, yelling that they were recruiting girlfriends, and Klaus and the butler just froze, staring in disbelief as the butler blurted out, "Why are you stripping?" Two maids who had just arrived gasped the same way. The butler snapped them back into place, barking for everyone to line up. Then he hauled out a massive weight scale, slammed the truth down. This was their job for the day, and told them to try it out. The knights wasted no time, stripping down to the barest minimum as they prepared to step onto the scale. While Klaus, seeing this wild sight, erupted into laughter, and the butler beamed with a huge grin, pushing them to take off everything. He watched the Miller Knights, humbled down to their undergarments, get put through that weird weight test, and one of them swore it was the only way to measure them right since their clothes had to come off. Ruin, Latte, and a maid stood there watching the whole thing, but the maid's eyes were the sharpest, like she was hunting for the smallest mistake. When the inspection wrapped up, he tipped a hand in farewell to the knights and told them, "Use the new scale for a while, then tell me what you think." They bowed right back, respectful and ready. Outside the facility, he geared up to leave by carriage with Ruin, Latte, and the butler, and right before the wheels rolled, he couldn't stop wondering, would Latte come with him to the next inspection? He knew it was going to be a huge orphanage still under construction, and Ruin made it clear the next inspection was set for the very next day. After he finally made it back home safe, Anna, his maid, snapped open the door and greeted him, then told him straight up that someone was dying to talk the moment he'd settled in, because a big conversation was waiting inside that grand estate. Inside, he spotted Elise sitting there, her face split between grateful relief and uneasy worry. She thanked him for the dress, and watching her, a sharp little spark of hope hit him. Maybe Latte was finally starting to feel better. Even so, Elise stayed crushed, eyes locked on her lap as she finally told him she didn't feel like she deserved all that kindness. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, and from the doorway, Anna quietly watched every second. Even inside herself, she couldn't stop spiraling, realizing just how deep those feelings went, and knowing she had to rush to Klaus to apologize for what she'd gotten so wrong. Finally, she lifted her gaze, resolute sadness burning in her eyes, and declared, "I'm disqualified from being your fiancé." He froze, staring at her in pure shock. What? Why? A searing memory slammed into her. When those orcs attacked and fear swallowed everything, she screamed for help, begging to be saved. But in that raw, gut-wrenching terror, Klaus never even crossed her mind. Guilt and shame crushed her until she buried her face in her hands, and when Klaus came to her with desperation, she still couldn't even think of him when she needed help most. He just stood there watching, worry carved deep across his face. She stayed seated, hiding her face in her hands, while Klaus dropped to his knees in front of her, reaching out with raw concern, calling her name like he couldn't breathe, his voice shaking with worry. Klaus rushed to comfort her, begging her to stop blaming herself, his hands hovering right by hers as he tried to pour warmth into her grief. She finally locked eyes with him, her gaze trembling with tears she refused to spill. And he confessed that it had only been a few months since he'd shed his old self. So yeah, he understood if she couldn't fully trust him yet. Then he said she didn't have to force anything. He kept talking, confessing that something had been gnawing at him for ages, and he insisted she take all the time she needed, even if it took years, so she could finally tell him the truth burning in her heart. He practically begged her to watch him, to witness every move he made, and he laid it out. Before the game even started, him and Latte weren't actually connected in the story setting. He admitted he'd been trying to earn Latte's trust. Then he froze mid-sentence, suddenly realizing what his own words just revealed. Then he slammed his decision down. He was breaking off the engagement, and swore he'd grind harder, become worthy of her somehow. He admitted he had no clue what tomorrow would bring, but he'd fight with everything he had right now. Now he steadied himself, took her hands gently, and met her eyes with raw sincerity, begging, wordless, to reach the very center of her heart. On a blazing beach, a blonde girl, face streaked with grime, rips into a ready stance with a vicious spiked bat, while a dark-haired girl beside her grips a handful of tiny round objects, watching every move like she's waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her blonde power swing smashed a massive watermelon into a storm of shattered pieces, and its red flesh with black seeds sprayed across the sand. Meanwhile, Klaus didn't slow down. He kept pushing his sales plan and checked out the weight scale installation site, then told Ruin, "I hit the Miller Knights training facility yesterday, and now we've finally made it to the destination." What? They were headed straight for the spa resort Gnosis, this massive beauty of a place, wrapped in scaffolding like it was still being built, but with a stunning entrance lined by elegant statues. Klaus froze at the sight, stunned, and blurted out what kind of world this even was, until Ruin told him it was the hot spring she'd mentioned yesterday, complete with a pool. Then it hit him, he was really standing in the game's world. His mind painted the resort like a glowing paradise, pure wine, pure women, pure temptation, and his heart started slamming in his chest. Ruin clocked his distraction and snapped, "You listening?" He shot back, "Yes." Fast, and she went on telling him that everything beyond the hot spring had been under construction ever since before the game even started. She asked if he wanted to hit the hot springs first, or even soak in a bath. Then he snapped out, calling to Latte and urging her to come over right away. He spun to Elise, grabbed her hands, and asked if Latte could tag along with them tomorrow. Elise stared back, face set, saying she no longer doubted him, even though he still hadn't told her where they were headed. She nodded, eyes bright, saying that if Klaus was the one pulling her in, then it had to be a place worth every second. Elise double-checked her earlier claim. Yep, the destination really was a hot spring. And then she stepped up with zero hesitation, saying she'd personally escort Latte to the women's bath, while Klaus only needed to trust her. Klaus didn't hesitate for a second either. He fully trusted Elise to handle it. Elise watched Latte smile and right then remembered the hot spring's insane healing power, especially for Latte's injured leg, and swore she'd do everything in her power for her. In the men's bath, thick steam curled up from the hot water as a few guys finally let their shoulders drop, while a huge, muscular man with a towel over his head leaned in and splashed water over himself, the echo roaring through the haze. Klaus slipped into the steamy hot spring with the other man and watched an older bather sink into pure bliss, smiling like nothing in the world could hurt him. Klaus couldn't wrap his head around how anyone could be that happy. Still soaked in the soothing hot springs, Klaus kept zoning out over how healing they felt, especially for Latte's hurt leg, until a wild gut-punch realization hit him. This wasn't just a relaxing bath anymore. It was the perfect setup for a peeping scene inside the game world. The shock hit them fast, and the bath instantly erupted in chaos. Two muscular men shot upright, faces blazing with startled fury, barking angry shouts and splashing water everywhere as they whirled toward the commotion. He bolted out of the bath, naked and panicking, scrambling away from what just happened. Inside, Klaus clenched his guilt. He finally clocked it was his own fault since he'd cracked the wall here before, accidentally making the very peeping hole that dragged him into this mess. Klaus slumped against the wall, finally breathing easy like he'd dodged a disaster. Then two hulking men from the bath closed in, their shadows swallowing the moment. Standing there before him, completely naked, the men calmly demanded to know what was wrong, while Klaus froze, flustered and caught off guard, scrambling to even get a sensible answer out. Still flustered, he tried to talk his way out of it, insisting he was only testing the building's structural integrity. Then one of the men cut him off with a calm grin. Everything was fine. He stood there in front of those two bulky men, scrambling to explain himself, but the older one just stared in disbelief, demanding how Klaus could be reckless enough to punch a peeping hole, especially when he was Lord Faust's man. The other man matched his fury and swore he'd report everything to Garum, making it sound deadly serious, until Klaus threw himself in the middle and begged, "Let me wash your backs," trying to cool them down before it all exploded. As the confrontation dragged on, Klaus realized there was no way he could have predicted that one tiny crack would have turned into a full-on peeping hole, and that thought did nothing to ease the nightmare he was stuck in. Meanwhile, the women's bath was pure peace. Water roared down from a massive statue into the steamy pool as two young women kicked back, soaking in the quiet of the evening. Amira plunged even deeper into the warm water, eyes snapping upward at the full moon blazing in the night sky. As the night dragged on, Amira and Latte leaned in and talked. Amira pointed out the moon had two of them and Latte nodded like, yeah, I see it too. Their talk kept rolling and Amira wouldn't hold back. She was sure Klaus was meant for greatness. Latte nodded hard, then blurted, yeah, but why do I feel it too? Amira then stepped up and announced she'd stand by Klaus no matter what, ready to fight beside him every step of the way. Latte leaned in, zeroing in on Amira as she spoke straight to her, face dead serious. Amira then leaned in and made a wild promise to Latte she'd grow strong, no question, because her instincts never missed. Across the way, Klaus, dressed in a yukata, scratched his chin and plotted his next move, scrolling through bath choices on a glowing screen, including a few that looked downright tempting. Fresh out of his bath, Klaus pushed aside the curtain and stepped into the room feeling brand new, and the butler immediately lit up, praising how sharp he looked in that yukata, while Ruin sat nearby on the weighing scale. Then he snapped his focus to Ruin, barreling toward her and shouting her name. As he closed in, he accidentally flicked his eyes to the scale, and boom, Ruin's weight was staring back at him on the display. He went pale, snapped his gaze away and covered his eyes, while Ruin stood there stunned, mortified, and visibly embarrassed. She snapped at him right away, drilling home how privacy matters, and demanded that scales be kept in separate spaces for men and women. Moments later, that breathtaking Ruin burst into view, now dressed in an elaborate yukata, right beside Latte and Amira, both stepping out in gorgeous yukatas too, and he just gawked, wide-eyed and stunned. He asked Latte if she could handle the walk, still haunted by that old injury, and when she told him the pain had eased, his shoulders finally dropped and pure relief washed over him. Suddenly, a loud crowd of guests in matching yukatas came charging by, whipping up total chaos, and Latte stumbled, then crashed to the ground. When he saw that unruly crowd, he shot Latte a suggestion. Let's slip away to somewhere quieter, far from the crush of people. As night thickened, he and Latte held hands and strolled beneath the starry sky, slipping away from the loud, bustling world behind them. They burst into a peaceful, open-air garden under the full moon's glow and a sky packed with stars, and Latte just stood there, eyes wide, staring up like she couldn't believe it. And then she breathed out that it was absolutely breathtaking. She flashed Klaus a soft, reassuring smile, clearly getting it. This trip to the hot spring wasn't random at all. It was his way of showing he cared. Klaus, across from her, admitted he couldn't do much, but the thought of her feeling even a little better lit him up inside, and then he gestured for her to sit. Latte, moved by his words, thanked him. Lot, now settled in her seat, told Klaus she was overflowing with gratitude, especially for what he did during that stampede, and then she dropped her bombshell. She'd made a decision, leaving Klaus staring at her in pure shock. She leaned in, eyes locked on him, and declared her next move, straight into the future. Her eyes locked onto Klaus like a warning, and as the world blurred behind her, ghostly game-like interface symbols flickered, like she'd pledged herself to something deeper and system-backed. Latte's words rang out, I'll never leave your side, and it hit twice. First as a game-like prompt, then as pure heartfelt truth, with a vision of her in a more formal dress appearing above to make every bit of her promise feel heavy and real. Klaus heard her unshakable vow and a deep blush flooded his face. His eyes popped wide with shock and yeah, a little embarrassment too. He reached for her, brushed her hand with a gentle touch, and murmured her name, Latte. Klaus snapped to it, eyes bulging wider as a blazing exclamation mark popped up, like a critical insight hit him full force. It hit him, Latte's I'll never leave your side wasn't just sweet talk at all. It was exactly what he'd seen flashing on that game screen before. With a jolt, he realized Latte's vow, her promise to never leave his side, wasn't some sudden burst of her own will at all. It was a pre-written line in the game's script, specifically delivered to Kaido in that exact moment. His mind went into overdrive, flashing back to the game's interface and what usually happens right after a declaration like that. And suddenly he was replaying old moments in his head, caught in fragmented memories of himself and Latte, realizing that every move they made would slam them into a specific outcome. As the memories hit harder, he started to remember the game's scenes, one more intimate and brutal than the last. His eyes bulged with panic, and a silent gasp tore out of him the moment those pixelated love scenes between the protagonist and Latte flashed behind his eyes. Even with those unsettling memories crashing back, he still forced a small, bittersweet smile, just enough to say a quiet thanks to Latte and to his own thoughts. Then he made a hard choice in his chest. He wouldn't blindly follow the script. If anyone was going to rewrite the future, it was him. Later, as he sat beside his new companion, a young woman with long dark hair, she calmly pressed him for the truth, asking what he really wanted for Latte, what he wished Latte would become. He stared off to the side, his inner war written all over his face as he thought, I'm not the protagonist. A fresh chapter kicked off, and right away it teased something huge. Klaus stood there, unshakable, staring into the looming darkness of someone who hadn't even appeared yet. Carriage kicked off his week-long sprint toward the royal capital. while Latte, finally fully healed from her injuries, made her way back home. Meanwhile, Amira and the Golden Destruction Brigade were on escort duty, making sure everyone stayed safe, and deep inside the heart of Karach, Klaus replayed the letter from his father, Kylem, the one that lit the fuse and sent him on this path. The whole trip ran like a precision mission. This one-ton carriage rolled out at a steady 20 km/h, like a marathon runner refusing to slow down. Every 30 minutes they stopped to swap horses and kept hammering forward, riding until sunset. With that brutal rhythm, they crushed 50 to 70 km a day, stacking up a whopping 350 to 490 km by the end of the week. Back in his old life, the trek from his home to the royal capital felt like a quick Tokyo-Nagoya day trip, and that nostalgic thought tugged a faint smile onto his lips. At last, the royal capital snapped into view, an eye-popping stronghold in the Mott and Bailey style, the real deal, like a whole castle town built to awe you. Right as they reached the city gates, everything stalled, carriages piled up, backed by officials checking every last one. Klaus snapped with impatience and ordered his butler to push straight to the main street because his tailor was waiting with his clothes. He told him to catch Makai the second he showed up and bring word immediately. Latte just stood there, watching the chaos unfold. Right after he stepped inside, he couldn't stop staring at the central plaza, massive, loud, and alive. With all those waterways, this city felt richer than his own territory, and it set his mind racing straight to what comes next. At 15, he'll enter the academy, the exact stage of that super grand romance game. And beside him, Latte pointed at a particular shop, grinning as she confirmed, "This is the one from the game." Right as they stepped up to the dress shop, a woman greeted them with a bright, warm smile, then Klaus froze, because standing there in full elegance was Riina. With a soft, winning smile, Ruina stepped up and introduced herself as the Rini Trading Company's representative, and then dropped the bomb. She was Ruin's older sister. Ruina stood in that fancy dress shop, eyes locked on every beautiful outfit, and when a polite clerk told her to wait just a moment, Ruinas couldn't shake the feeling that she was all alone in there. Right as the thought hit her, boom, he slammed through the door. A spiky blonde young man shouting that commoners were everywhere, and he instantly jabbed at Klaus, barking that he was one too. Klaus froze, stunned, and the guy kept pressing the insult, poking his cheek like it was personal. That angry kid kept going, jabbing his finger straight into Klaus's face and calling him an enemy, just because their eyes locked, and Klaus's face snapped from pure shock into simmering fury. He then proudly declared, "I'm Hero Kaido," and Klaus's face told you he recognized that name. Kaido shot back, demanding to know who Klaus really was, but Klaus stayed cool and answered, "Klaus Mueller." That name hit Kaido too. He stared for a beat, then muttered that he'd heard it somewhere before. Kaido's eyes flicked to Ruina's. He clocked her as one of the heroines. Then he instantly shut her down, snarling that she was a pathetic little sub-heroine. Ruina's dropped her gaze, crushed with pure dejection. He slashed his insult with a crude gesture, sticking out his tongue and barking out a mocking noise, tearing Ruina's down even harder. Klaus watched Kaido's brutal disrespect hit again and again, and his jaw locked shut as fury twisted across his face. Kaido kept hammering Ruinous with insults, sneering that she shouldn't get cocky just because she's thin, and to make it sting, he jabbed his finger right at her head. Klaus watched, furious and visibly boiling. As Kaido yanked at Riene like he could force fate itself, shouting for her to become his woman, Riene fought back hard. And the shock on Kaido's face was instant when she snapped that she was Klaus's maid. Klaus, who had been watching the whole mess spiral out of control, stared like he'd just been blindsided. Kaido froze for a split second at Riene's declaration, then snapped back to full arrogance. He scoffed and declared himself a hero, so Klaus was nothing but small fry beneath him. With a cocky, wide grin, he declared that every woman in this world was destined to belong to him. Rage detonated in Klaus and he swung hard, clipping Kaido right in the face and stunning him on the spot, while Latte gasped, utterly shocked by the sudden violence. Tato jerked back and clapped a hand to his face, sputtering that no one, especially his own father, had ever dared hit him. Then he snapped that Klaus better not open his mouth first. Latte stared in sheer horror as Klaus, a bruise already blooming on his cheek, looked down, his thoughts spinning around one stunned question. Why? Hato stumbled back, then surged forward again, rage blazing as he raised his fist at Klaus. Latte saw it coming and lunged to stop him. She lunged between Klaus and Kaido, clung to him like her life depended on it, and begged Kaido to stop, saying he could hit her instead, while Klaus just stood there, wide-eyed, still stunned by how fast everything exploded. Kaido snapped his tongue the moment he saw Latte step in, fuming that it was pathetic for a man to need saving by a woman. Then he ranted that her move had totally ruined his mood. Kaido snapped off one final, dismissive remark, spun around and stormed out, yelling that they were done for the day to a guy named Misha. Klaus just stood there, staring after him, his head still stuck on what Kaido said earlier and why he'd said it at all. As the door slammed shut, Klaus stood there alone, gripping a maid uniform like it was his last lifeline. Klaus remembered Kaido's swagger about women being his destiny, then Ruina's claim that she belonged to Klaus as his maid, and his eyes hardened with a fresh, unshakable resolve. He swept Anna into a tight embrace, and she stared up at him with wide, trembling eyes. Then he rushed out an apology for scaring her, while Kaido's cruel taunts still echoed in his head about how he's supposedly the cool protagonist who protects everyone. He kept reassuring her, thanking her for worrying, then made it crystal clear. He wouldn't let her risk herself or do anything dangerous for him. She softly swallowed his words and let out a whisper of a reply, melting into his comforting embrace. Their sweet embrace got yanked apart when Latte burst in with a package, grinning from ear to ear and declaring she'd finally returned. He got flustered, still clutching Anna and Latte, smiling like she already knew, teased, asking if she'd barged into something. He instantly snapped that it wasn't what it looked like. Next, the butler clocked his bruised face and gasped in shock at what he was seeing, while Latte and another mate stood right there, waiting by the carriage. The butler gasped, grabbed his own head, and blurted that running into Hero Kaido had been the worst mistake of his life. Then he wondered if that meeting had gone wrong from the start. Then he broke down the shaky political storm inside the Gyuraka kingdom, how Duke Garam's royalists ruled one side, while Kaido's hero faction stood for the other, and he couldn't shake the question. Was someone out there actively pushing Kaido into becoming a real, legendary hero? The butler kept going, fretting that Klaus had just slapped Kaido and that disaster was coming fast, while Klaus, still bruised, snapped the thought down in his head like, one punch doesn't end this. Then the butler urged them to head straight to the mansion to get things ready for the... Then the story swung over to the Muir family's town place, an enormous, intimidating mansion that screamed, "This is where the nobles live." Klaus stood in the grand room, staring like he'd just heard the impossible. As the butler announced a commendation ceremony, Klaus snapped back that he would have turned it down if he'd known it was all tied to the stampede incident, but the butler swore it was a glorious celebration. Even while the butler kept going, Klaus realized the ceremony wasn't just for show. There were darker, deeper plans lurking behind it all, and still shirtless, he demanded to know what they could possibly be. As Latte wrestled Klaus into his formal attire, she leaned in and spilled the ugly politics. The hero faction wanted to jack up its power by crowning Kaido, so the king pushed this ceremony with the Muir family to lock in their alliance, and the pressure was so bad, her stomach started to ache. Then she finally clocked it. His hair had grown way too long. He told her to cut it later, and she nodded right away, eager to do as he said. Latte leaned in close and worked her magic on Klaus' face, covering his bruises like it was nothing, and Klaus just thanked her, genuinely grateful. Decked head to toe in his ornate formal wear, Klaus cut an unforgettable figure, and the butler blurted out how impressed he was. Then the butler declared it was time to head to the castle, swearing the carriage would be waiting right at the entrance, and Klaus gave the instruction a clear nod. Right before they left, Latte softly brushed Klaus's cheek, like she couldn't help but worry for him. She noticed he'd shot up taller, and when he clocked her staring, he smirked back with a soft smile. The Grand Mirror family castle loomed overhead, its towering walls and sharp turrets thrusting into the sky like a warning proof of just how much power and influence they ruled with. In the castle's towering, glittering hall, a lone figure stood locked in silence. Then his voice boomed through the space, calling out to you as Your Highness. Klaus burst into the grand royal hall and strode straight toward the throne, where the king sat with a proud noble at his side. He dropped into a deep bow as the king warmly waved him closer, and Klaus couldn't stop wondering what kind of ruler waited behind that smile. As he knelt before the throne, the king's face lit up with shock, pointing out how Klaus was somehow tied to the family. No one saw it coming. Even the noble standing next to him couldn't hide his surprise. The noble admitted that half the far-off lords were still nowhere near the capital, and the king nodded. So the commendation ceremony got pushed back, with a promise that the wait would be worth it for a celebration worthy of legends. With a fierce stare, the king praised Klaus for tearing down a general orc and called it pure legend, then leaned in with a personal request, when he wanted Klaus to handle before the grand ceremony even started, leaving the kids staring back, completely wide-eyed. In some shadowy corner, a woman's silhouette leaned in and asked her companion, "So you'll really hand our daughter over to my son?" The man only smirked and told her, "The ceremony's set for the 15th, count the days, you'll see." Duke Garam lifted the young boy high overhead, beaming like the whole world had come back to him, greeting his son with a thunderous joy after that long absence, marveling at how much he'd grown, and declaring he was thrilled they'd finally get to live together for a while. Seated high on the throne, the king turned to Duke Garam, who stood there with his young boy, then asked straight up if Garam would let his son and daughter come to meet him, because the king had a request ready to drop. Aram walked side by side with Klaus, the young boy, and a young girl, and told them straight. The king didn't just want a mission, he wanted them to forge a real bond with the prince and princess. Then he pointed it out, no hesitation. The princess was stuck dealing with the hero Kaido and needed a bodyguard. Klaus looked stunned, like, "Kaido, really?" Because in his mind, Kaido felt way too rough around the edges. Klaus slumped as Garam pressed a hand to his head, and Klaus blurted out his apology to his father. confessing he'd heard from Makai and somehow, by pure coincidence, ended up crossing paths with the hero. Garam calmed him down, insisting that just meeting the hero wouldn't be the issue at all, then pressed him about whether Klaus had even reported the slap incident, clearly worried sick about his son. As they kept strolling through the palace halls, Garam jerked his finger at a door and said, "That's it, the room we're after," while royal guards stood rigid in the corridor like statues. Inside the room, a young princess with long blonde pigtails sprawled on the couch, bored out of her mind and grumbling about the wait, while the other young princess with shorter blonde hair froze in shock when a knock slammed at the door. The moment the door swung open, Charlotte, the pigtail princess, shot up like a spring and sprinted straight at the newcomers, shouting a bright greeting to Uncle Garam, and even he had to admit her reflexes were insanely sharp. Charlotte snapped her focus to the young boy Klaus standing right beside Garam and jabbed a finger at him, asking, "Did you lose weight?" Garam then stepped in, introduced Klaus as his son, and added that Klaus and Charlotte were the same age. Charlotte clutched her dress and brushed off the idea of a gift, saying she didn't need any of that, while her brother Dennis just introduced himself. Then Klaus blinked in shock when he realized the blonde twin princess was Charlotte, and that this wasn't their first encounter. Panic hit him as he realized what that old meeting with Princess Charlotte could mean, but she acted like it was nothing, saying they may have crossed paths when she was 3, yet she had zero memory of it. Still, she couldn't help but smile. Her uncle had played with her, teased that she was made with real love for it, and then she begged for one more like she couldn't wait another second. Moments later, the playful princess had scrambled onto Duke Garam's shoulders, insisting he play with her and swearing she'd punish him if he didn't, while the Duke, worn to the bone, just let out a helpless sigh as Prince Dennis watched everything play out. He burst into a run, hoisting Charlotte on his shoulders as Dennis sprinted right beside them, and Charlotte beamed, insisting she only needed one more lap just for. The Duke kept sprinting through sheer strain, the princess still riding high on his shoulders, and the young prince matched his pace right alongside him. Meanwhile, Klaus watched, scratching his head, wondering if this whole wyvern obsession was really something kids were into. At last, the Duke slammed the verdict, "Game over," but Charlotte exploded into protest, demanding they keep going. Klaus watched it all and realized just how rare it was for anyone to play with the princess like that. Still balanced on his shoulders, she puffed her cheeks in a defiant pout, while the Duke beneath her looked totally wiped out, and Dennis and Klaus just stared at that stubborn princess. The Duke's exhaustion kept climbing, sweat pounding down his brow as he fought tooth and nail to stay composed while the princess's weight dragged him down. Seeing the Duke's crushed, hopeless face, Klaus snapped and shouted a warning, "Don't look." With a heavy sigh, the Duke gave up, fell back into the wyvern play, Charlotte riding on his shoulders, while Dennis trotted along, grinning like he'd just won the whole world. He kept playing, the exhaustion showing in every breath, while Princess Charlotte lit up with pure joy and shouted that the game was way too fun to stop. Then she turned to Klaus and ordered him to fetch her father and bring them back to their room, with Prince Dennis watching from right there. His body was finally done for, slumped in total exhaustion, while the princess still burned with endless energy. Klaus just stood there, watching the Duke's misery in silence. While Klaus kept watching, Princess Charlotte suddenly stole the spotlight with a massive announcement. Starting today, for one whole week, he and Prince Dennis would train at the Miller family residence. Then she said they could call her Char, and Klaus looked genuinely stunned, while Dennis only nodded like he'd already accepted it. His surprise curdled fast into discomfort when he realized the 20 royal guards were staring at him and the kids, dead intense. Charlotte, totally oblivious, just shrugged it off and said they were her bodyguards. She marched them to the garden for warm-up drills, swearing it was the perfect practice spot, but Klaus couldn't shake a nagging thought. Why would Sharn, a heroine-level character, need protection from Kaido, a dude he didn't even remember from the game? He switched up the whole training plan, telling her they weren't going to stick to the game's script. He'd drill her in real techniques to keep her safe from Kaido, and Charlotte, eyes set with determination, nodded fast, hungry to learn. With eyes locked in, he snapped into a defensive stance, showing exactly how to parry an attack from a pretend Kaido. She stared him down, copied his stance move for move, and demanded to know if she nailed it. Then he barked out what to do next. He kept steering her through it, telling her that if she hit Kaido's weak spot, his whole onslaught would freeze. And when Charlotte mirrored his pointing, the light clicked in her eyes as the pretend Kaido staggered with a sharp, pained grimace. Then she told her once Kaido's on his back and his movement dies, they need to bolt. Charlotte's eyes snapped wide as everything clicked into place. She stared in total shock as Klaus broke down how that spell only hit Kaido. And then he doubled down, dead certain, like he knew the real reason was her blonde twin tails. Meanwhile, Klaus stewed in his thoughts, realizing he'd reincarnated before he even finished the game. And now he couldn't stop wondering if Princess Charlotte and Prince Dennis belonged to some no-play route he'd never touched. While he was spiraling, she blurted out with huge excitement that once she mastered this one technique, her training would be done and she wouldn't need a sword anymore. Until he snapped back fast, insisting she'd still need the sword. Then he relayed the king's words, saying His Majesty wanted both of them, and especially Klaus, to get stronger for what's coming next, and it was the king himself who'd just thrown the idea of training at them. He knitted his brow, lost in thought, and realized, if this was all just about forging stronger bonds, then sword training wouldn't even be on the list. The king's command had to be hiding something darker. With a confident grin, he challenged Princess Charlotte to a duel with wooden swords, promising that if she landed even one solid hit, her training was officially done. Her eyes went wide, then she squealed with pure excitement, snatched a wooden sword, and surged forward with a triumphant yay. Prince Dennis, stuck watching from the sidelines, snapped out to his sister with a worried look on his face. She lunged with her wooden sword, but he slipped out of the way like it was nothing, smooth, precise, and perfectly timed. As she lunged again, he slipped out of the way with sickening ease, darting so fast she only swiped at empty air. With one sharp, decisive strike, he knocked her weapon aside, drove her to her knees, and pinned his wooden sword just inches from her throat. Then he leaned in and said, calm as can be, that in a real fight her head would have already been cut clean off. She collapsed to her knees on the cold ground, drained to the bone, and let out a weak, miserable groan. Prince Dennis saw her like that and tried to reach for Klaus, but Klaus yanked his arm back hard, barking that she'd be fine as long as she kept training. He kept training with Prince Dennis, hammering sword techniques until they burned into muscle, while Princess Charlotte watched like her life depended on it, and then asked, straight up, whether she could ever get strong enough to protect her brother through that brutal practice. He locked eyes with her and flashed a calm, reassuring smile, making it crystal clear that she could absolutely reach that strength. With that push, she immediately grabbed a wooden sword and started her training right away, blazing with fierce determination, while he watched her pride shine through, knowing it would propel her forward. From that day on, he threw himself into his studies like his life depended on it, devouring facts about the country while still hammering training for both Princess Charlotte and Princess Dennis. And then, just like that, a week of non-stop learning and practice blew past. As the week started winding down, he crashed into bed and stared at the ceiling, knowing he'd soon have to say goodbye to Charlotte and Dennis. Then his mind snagged on Latte, wondering whether the dress he sent a week ago ever made it to her. Out of nowhere, a ghostly Latte drifted in front of him, thanking him for the beautiful dress. Then he blurted out a shocked gasp, eyes wide, bursting with joy, because seeing her again felt like he'd missed her more than he ever admitted. He lunged at her with arms wide to wrap her in his grip. Then his body slid straight through her, and he slammed onto the floor with a jolt that snapped him back. Before dawn even broke, it hit him, every bit of it had been a dream. Then he snapped his focus into reality, and a frantic racket outside made his heart race, like someone might be fleeing. He threw on his gear in a flash, snatched up his sword, and bolted out of his room, then froze when he saw Princess Charlotte and Prince Dennis sprinting away from the castle like something had exploded inside it. And he couldn't stop himself from thinking, what horrible thing just happened? What? He sprinted after them, his mind snapping with panic, and when Princess Charlotte whipped around, her eyes went huge with shock as she realized he was chasing them. He spun on Princess Charlotte and Prince Dennis, grilling them in a panic, demanding to know where they were headed. Then Charlotte stared him down and said she'd been waiting for this exact moment to break free of the castle. Her voice carried a heavy ache as she pressed on. She had to learn more about her dead mother, and this journey was the only way. Klaus tried to talk her out of it, begging her to stop, but Charlotte refused to budge. She was going no matter what. Prince Dennis, gripping a wooden sword, stepped in and vowed he'd protect his sister. And when Klaus saw that iron resolve, he finally understood he had to tag along. They kept walking for what felt like an hour, and Klaus finally clocked it. This wasn't just the forest park outside the royal capital like he'd thought. Charlotte kept moving and pointed straight ahead, right at the Grand Nate Gate, declaring, "That's the entrance to the sacred forest." He froze when the words sacred forest hit, because he knew that name. Charlotte leaned in and told him it was a place her dead mother had lived in too, and the way she said it made it clear, there's something bigger tying them together. She pushed them forward, insisting they still had a long way to go, then marched ahead with fresh, unstoppable purpose. He scanned the area baffled, while Charlotte and Dennis kept moving ahead, because to him nothing around them looked even remotely special. He kept sweeping the area with his eyes, but the more he tried to figure out what Charlotte was seeing, the deeper his confusion sank. Suddenly he gasped, eyes snapping wide as he spun back like something had just grabbed him or slipped out of view. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head in pure confusion, and when he looked up, Princess Charlotte and Prince Dennis were gone, out of sight, out of reach. They're gone, he realized, and his eyes spun wildly across the sacred forest, heart pounding as panic kicked in. He bolted into the thick foliage, tearing through the trees, desperate to find where they'd vanished to. His frantic search snapped into a nightmare. He clutched his head, sweat pouring down his brow, because a horrifying vision tore through his mind. The king, furious, declared the princess and prince missing and blamed Klaus alone, until the nightmare ended with Klaus hauled onto the gallows and executed in front of everyone. The sheer dread of that future crashed over him like a doom-filled alarm. Panic hit Klaus like a storm. His eyes bulged with pure terror as he clutched his head, the shock of it all slamming into him all at once. He dropped to his knees, desperate to make sense of everything, how it all disappeared and where it could have gone. He kept replaying that moment when Charlotte and Dennis headed for the gate's shadow, convinced they'd just slipped away, and he knew he had to wrench his thoughts into order and figure out the real story behind what just happened. While he was deep in thought, his eyes snagged on something off, an odd ripple in the ground that immediately pulled him in. An instinct yanked the moment into motion, and he started digging like his life depended on it, till something solid broke through the soil. Then he spotted the edge of a nearby shadow and bolted straight toward it. He dropped to his knees again, brushing the dirt away with care, and bam, there it was, a crisp crest, a royal emblem unmistakable. He fixed his eyes on the unearthed crest, confusion crashing across his face, then slowly lifted his gaze like he could feel someone watching from the shadows. Right in front of him stood Charlotte and Dennis, and the sight hit him like a jolt, especially Charlotte, who looked genuinely stunned at what he'd found, blurting out a quiet, shocked exclamation. Klaus let out a breath of relief when he saw them unharmed, bursting with joy that they were safe. Charlotte even confirmed he'd pulled off that teleport for real, despite being royal, and then shocked everyone by blasting straight into the very heart of the forest in one single, unstoppable leap. His teleportation yanked them into a huge open stretch, where an ancient, hulking stone structure towered over everything. Charlotte pointed it out and shouted that it was the old shrine, tucked deep inside the sacred forest. Dennis stared into the trees, and with a serious look on his face, he told me this forest, born in the age of myths, was packed with magic, crawling with powerful demons, and even once served as a home for the gods. Suddenly, a chilling presence crashed into the air, and everyone recoiled at once. Klaus snapped his sword out immediately, eyes blazing with alarm, while Charlotte and Dennis braced themselves for a fight. Right in front of them stood a tall, elegant man with long blonde hair, a sly smirk tugging at his lips as he smoked his pipe, and with a chuckle he bragged that they hadn't even felt him there. Then the man stepped forward and announced, loud and proud, that he was the guardian of the sacred forest, and the one running the old shrine, finishing with a cheeky grin as he declared he was an absolute. Klaus stayed on high alert and grilled the man's claim, saying he'd never even heard of such a guardian. Then Charlotte backed him up, revealing even the royal family wasn't told about this at all. The man just smirked and said his existence was a secret known only to a tiny handful inside the royal bloodline. He pressed on, grilling him about why the royal family would hide his existence, especially from the prince and princess. The man puffed on a slow, measured drag from his pipe, and his face stayed impossible to read. Then the man finally tore off the mask. He wasn't just some stranger. He was a demigod forged from both god and human, and he told us how his family had guarded this forest's old shrine for generations, tied to an ancient contract etched between his ancestors and the royal family. He pressed on, saying that even a demigod, especially a descendant, sits so close to a god that people would start worshipping them, and the royal family would have zero reason to let that chaos spill into their own household. Klaus suddenly saw it, and it hit like lightning. Their country was already split between the royalist and hero sides, so if a new idol suddenly showed up, it would spark total chaos and confusion. Charlotte choked on a gasp, staring at the same terrifying truth. Charlotte was shaking with grief as she demanded to be let into the old shrine, swearing this was exactly where her mother died. She pushed harder, demanding to know if stepping inside would finally expose how her mother really died, only for the guardian to lock eyes with her and say, "If you're truly a royal, then you'll have to pass the trial first." Meanwhile, Klaus hovered beside Dennis, wringing his hands as he asked if kids were even allowed to try something like this. The guardian just took a slow, smoky puff from his pipe and said he'd answer anything he knew. Charlotte clutched her resolve and declared she'd take the trial, ready, trained, and fearless in her own skin. Klaus and Dennis panicked at her stubborn determination, blurting protests and trying to stop her, but the guardian cut through the noise with one chilling warning. This trial was brutally, dangerously extreme. Still stunned by the guardian's warning, Klaus fired off a question. Could he even go with Charlotte if he wasn't blood of the royal family? The guardian nodded and cleared him, saying Klaus was a child of a ducal house, a hidden branch of the royal bloodline. Lao snapped in shock that the guardian knew his exact lineage, and the guardian only let out a smug chuckle, smoke spilling from his mouth like a warning that he knew way more than he was saying. Without another word, the guardian leaned back and blasted a thick plume of smoke from his pipe, swallowing Klaus, Charlotte, and Dennis as it churned around them. Smoke exploded outward, swallowing the three youths in a thick, light-blocking wall that erased them from sight. Moments later, as the smoke finally thinned, the guardian calmly declared, "We're here." Klaus, Charlotte, and Dennis, still half hidden in the haze, stared around in stunned confusion. The smoke finally peeled away and boom, an insanely grand, glittering interior opened up before them. The guardian checked in and said they'd landed inside the old shrine, and the three youths were left staring, stunned at how this magic shift happened so fast. He calmly told her the shrine still stood exactly like it did thousands of years ago, untouched by time itself. Charlotte stared in disbelief at how flawless it looked, only managing to blurt out that it was unbelievably beautiful, and the Guardian just smirked and said of course he was a demigod. As the Guardian spoke, Klaus shot a determined look and yanked his sword free, ready to meet whatever came next, and the Guardian matched him, drawing his blade with slow, deadly intent. He gripped his sword out in front, then the Guardian surged it upward and shouted that every last one of them would face a trial laid down by the gods. A blinding flash ripped the air open, and the Guardian burst forward with his sword outstretched, his strike warping the space around them as time itself froze in that single heartbeat. Charlotte, Klaus, and Dennis froze mid-swing. Boom, swords clattered out of their hands as the Guardian loomed over them, trapping all of them in one brutal, breath-holding instant. With mist spiraling around them, the Guardian warned, "This trial isn't happening here, it's going down in another dimension," then slammed the truth home. "No matter how long it drags on, time in your world won't move a single second." With smoke swallowing them whole, Charlotte, Klaus, and Dennis started to stumble, 1 second shocked, the next completely disoriented. They crashed through the swirling fog, their bodies dragging as if the air had turned to lead. Klaus fought to stay awake and then suddenly realized this wasn't any normal smoke wafting from a pipe. Soon, Charlotte and Klaus both gave in, crumpling into ethereal clouds as consciousness slipped away, while Klaus's final thought burned with one desperate question: when would they come back to reality? The Guardian stood stone still, staring as three unconscious companions lay battered in the fading smoke, their swords scattered around them. His trial was officially underway. He stood alone by the old shrine, watching the shimmering portals slowly wink out, while a thin curl of smoke drifted up from his pipe. And as he murmured to himself, he prayed with all his heart that they'd come back. Lost inside their unconsciousness, Klaus drifted through a pitch-black, watery void, and there, Lotte beckoned him from the dark as her voice cut through the silence. He lunged for her, and when his hand finally clasped hers, their lips crashed into a tender, breath-stopping kiss. Suddenly, the dream shattered. Klaus jolted awake when a sharp slap cracked through the silence. Charlotte loomed over him, face twisted with rage, roaring at him to wake up. She shook him hard and barked, "Get up," and Klaus, rattled and lost, finally started to come to. Klaus finally snapped back to consciousness and found himself sprawled on the ground, trapped in a ring of towering trees. While Charlotte staggered beside him, eyes wide, swearing she had no clue where they were, he nodded, realizing this definitely wasn't the shrine's sacred forest, and Dennis sat nearby in silence, staring just as stunned at the strange surroundings. The three of them huddled on a little mossy hump, surrounded by a wall of forest that seemed to go on forever, and Charlotte blurted out loud, what in the world they were even supposed to do for this trial. Lau steadied himself, then ordered, "For now, we scan our surroundings and stay on guard." He stormed to the crest, staring down at ancient trees, some so old they might as well be myth, until the whole forest screamed primeval. But Charlotte and the others gnawed at him. He wondered when they'd get back, then shoved the panic aside because one thing mattered right now. He had a focus. He made up his mind, he'd bring Charlotte and Dennis back safe, no matter what happens. Meanwhile, in a distant grand hall, a messenger burst in and slipped the message to the air before a maid could even get there, and the maid politely told him to hold on, offering him a meal while he waited for the reply. A message came in about Lotte, and she was lounging in a lavish room, staring at the gorgeous dress that had just been delivered to her. She bowed her head and thanked them, praying it would fit her perfectly. Lotte, the young woman, read the letter with trembling focus. Inside was the plan for a dress-up party the night before the royal capital's festival. Then Klaus the Cinder confessed his nerves and begged her to debut with him at the dance party right after it, promising he wanted the whole crowd to meet her as his fiancée, and he even said he'd sent a letter to the guild too. She slid into her seat at the desk, quill poised, and ripped through her reply with focus, because all she could think about was seeing Klaus soon. Moments later, she stood outside that massive building when a rider on horseback slid into place, ready to bolt. He delivered one last order, begging her to pass his regards to Klaus. Soon, Lotte found herself riding with a tight little entourage, and right there beside her was Amira, a blazing energy woman who waved like a firework and shouted that the moment she saw the letter, she sprinted over at once. Klaus, Charlotte, and Dennis suddenly found themselves trapped in a strange forest, yanked there by the guardian of the sacred forest for a trial. And as Klaus spotted a backpack and jabbed at it, Charlotte stared in shock while Dennis kept his face locked in grim focus. Dennis stood over the backpack's spill, staring as they'd been kitted out with a sword and a whole load of supplies. Klaus dropped to one knee and started digging through everything: dried meat, salt, sugar, a cup, a wooden spoon, skewers, a leather water bottle, flint and steel, rope, cloth, a bucket, a small pot, a knife, an axe, and more cloth. Then he grabbed the book and tore through the pages, until he realized every single one was totally blank, with not a single word anywhere. Right as he gripped it, the book erupted in dark, swirling light, knitting a strange, void-like pattern across its blank pages, and it totally stunned him. He locked onto the newly lit pages as glowing words blasted across them. Save the world tree, and for a moment, he couldn't help wondering if this trial was really that deep. Charlotte snapped to attention at the revelation, eyes blazing as she ordered them to race out and hunt for the world tree. Then Dennis' arm jerked as he was dragged forward, while Klaus stayed on his knees and stared up, stunned by the sudden surge of action. The two pair up and corner Klaus, who's now staggering under the weight of multiple heavy backpacks. Charlotte snaps, "What are you doing with all that?" And Dennis, smirking like he knows the punchline, says they've been handed a royal joke, like the whole burden was set on Klaus on purpose. Charlotte stood like she owned the place and told Klaus that hauling something this heavy was perfect training. Then she snapped, "Now hand over the other backpack," because Dennis was already loaded up. And Klaus, fed up, started to insist there's a right way to carry all that bulky gear. Meanwhile, a hand shot out toward the blazing sun, spilling golden light over a thick forest, like the world was daring him to start a huge, hard journey. As the day started to slip away, Klaus thrust his arm out, fingers spread, and told Dennis he was counting down the minutes to sunset. Then Dennis stared stunned and asked how he could possibly measure it without a mechanical clock or even a sundial. Then he put his plan on display, holding his fingers like a tiny sundial, pointing them straight at where the sun hung in the sky and saying each finger was about 15 minutes. He finished with a grin. They'd only got around an hour before night hit, and Dennis stared, absolutely blown away by the genius of it. As the sun slid toward the horizon, the trio, now with Charlotte in tow, huddled beside a towering ancient tree, and Klaus practically barked at them to set up camp before the forest swallowed the light. Klaus wrestled with flint and steel, sparks snapping through the air, until finally a tiny flame caught and he erupted in a triumphant cry, just relieved their campfire was alive, while Dennis loitered nearby clutching a coil of rope. As soon as the fire finally caught, Charlotte stepped in and nursed those newborn flames with steady hands. Dennis straightened up and swore his part was done perfect, while Klaus swung his sword into place and headed out to patrol the area. He burst through the tall grass and tangled undergrowth, senses razor-sharp, chasing every snap and rustle of the forest. As he pushed through his patrol, unease crept in like a shadow, first a faint presence, then something bigger, pressing closer and clearer by the second, and his face hardened with real worry. His senses flared to life. He just knew something was right here. Then a hulking shadow exploded from the trees and slammed into him like a nightmare. Out of nowhere, a hulking bear burst from the foliage, jaws gaping and claws flying. Klaus shrieked, barely yanked his sword free, and swung it up just in time to block the beast's savage lunge. He slammed his blade into the charging beast, the hit jarring him so hard he skidded back. Yet he refused to fold, teeth set, eyes locked on the bear as he braced for the next savage strike to defend himself. He got launched flying through the air, grin stretched wide as he spun out of control. The hit slammed him onto the ground, a sharp groan tearing out of his mouth as realization hit he'd never reinforced his body. And before he could even get up, a shadowy hooded figure dropped down on him, barking that he was a thief. The hooded figures tightened their grip around his neck until he choked out a gasp of pure agony. Then he fought to break free and demanded what they wanted, only to see one of them wince and clutch their own shoulder like it hurt them too. He tore free of the chokehold and blurted out his thanks to the hooded savior, but the figure just stared back, totally confused, like, "Wait, what did we even do?" Amira, hood dropped to reveal her true form, snapped, demanding a reward for her help. Then she pinned him to the ground in a blink, smirk dripping with bad intentions as she licked her lips, and he just groaned inwardly, realizing he'd somehow fallen straight into an eroge-fueled nightmare. Then he blurted out that she was an elf, and Amira froze. She snapped back hard, denying it with a panicked, distressed look that screamed she couldn't believe it. Amira's fierce reaction lit a fire under him, and he demanded to know if there was something bad about being an elf. Then she snapped back that elves were a rare species, hunted hard, and often auctioned off for insane prices as slaves. Learning Amira was actually in chains hit him like a punch to the gut, and it shoved him into a brutal question. Could slavery, with all its dark cruelty, really be a path this world allows? Shaking with outrage over the idea of elf slavery, he snapped that it was an abomination. And Amira, still visibly shaken, jumped in fast, agreeing it was pure injustice. Amira snapped, "I know Lily, the elf who only gives one clean, perfect piece of advice about magic," then pulled off her own shocking trick. She became a younger, childlike version of herself and explained that elves have an age that doesn't behave like ours, it shifts, it flows. Still trapped in her kid form, Amira stared as Klaus jabbed down a steep slope and shouted that something had dropped. And the second it hit her ears, she grilled him for what they'd snagged or what prize they'd won back from their last run. She cornered him and demanded answers, why he called her Lily and how he even knew her name, and Klaus went totally flustered, spitting out a shaky escape like, "I just thought you were as beautiful as a lily," praying she'd buy it. Moments later, Klaus found himself by the river, staring at a huge dark creature drifting in the water. And the best part was, being here made his job ridiculously convenient. He plunged into the shallow water to start scrubbing off the blood. But Amira snapped, warning him not to, because that scent would lure beasts from miles away and turn them into easy targets. Even after the warning, he went right ahead and expertly carved up the massive beast, tearing out its tender, edible meat. And all he could think about was how he'd seen stuff like this in videos too, only those were always censored. Amira recoiled at the butchered mess, eyes wide in disgust, and blurted out in shock. Then he stayed calm and said, "If we feed the local beasts, they'll stop hunting and we'll get a better shot at survival. It's a win-win." Once he was done and fully dressed, he snapped that hanging around was pointless and they had to leave right now while she watched, still stunned by what he'd just pulled. As night crashed down, the moon blazed high above the forest, spilling a gentle silver glow through the trees. Later, as the campfire crackled, Klaus, Amira, Charlotte, and Dennis huddled close. Charlotte and Dennis stared at Amira with wide eyes, freaking out that they'd never seen an elf, a princess, or a prince up close before. Amira, now in her adult form, grinned and basically told them to chill and get along, while Klaus kept tending the meat skewers, checking they were finally cooked and ready. Charlotte and Dennis clutched their skewers and barked nonstop about how there weren't any forks for the seasoning. But Klaus just shook out salt onto his plate, dug in, and ate like it was the best thing ever. Charlotte was still trying to wrap her head around this bizarre meal when Amira, tears pouring down her face, gobbled it up and blurted out how thankful she was to finally eat after 3 miserable days, while Klaus, lurking in the background, muttered that she better be quiet. After they finished eating, the whole crew huddled around a crackling campfire and started plotting their next move. Then someone blurted, "Do you know anything about the World Tree?" The mirror clutched a cup and then flashed the truth. Elijah's World Tree was in her own elven homeland. Hearing that, Charlotte's eyes sharpened and she snapped, "That's it. Our destination is decided." Klaus, already seated nearby, chimed in with one calm command. "All right, everyone get some sleep. We're leaving early tomorrow morning." As the night stretched on, Klaus and Dennis fell into deep sleep under their blankets, while the full moon bathed the quiet forest in soft, silver light. Even so, he stayed wide awake, crouched beside the campfire with sharp eyes, swearing he'd take the night watch. Sometime later, Charlotte stalked up to him, watching him carefully shave blades of grass with a tiny knife, and she demanded to know why he wouldn't just tie them together. Then he snapped his head up, shocked she was even there. Then she pressed, "You can't sleep, can you?" He jerked his eyes away, mortified, as she pulled out a handkerchief and scolded that a lady shouldn't have to tell a man what he needs out in the wilderness, only for him to realize she was handing it to him so he could relieve himself. She grabbed his arm and snapped that, as a princess, she couldn't turn a blind eye to her people's pain, and he nodded, recognizing her noblesse oblige resolve. He lowered his gaze, eyes narrowing with realization. He'd first shrugged her off as just a selfish young woman, but now he could feel the strength in her bones. Meanwhile, Dennis, eyes like saucers, spun around from behind the curtain just in time to see Charlotte yank Klaus up by the collar and drag him closer. Amira lay there trembling with illness, while the protagonist sat at her side, brow knit with worry. He leaned in and pressed his hand to her forehead, feeling the raging heat of her fever. Meanwhile, Latte pulled Charlotte and Klaus into the conversation, her voice shaking with worry as she spilled a line from Charlotte's letter, one that said Klaus's stomach felt wrong, and she fired off the question, "Is he sick right now?" Charlotte froze in shock. Back with Amira, her illness didn't let up. Coughing attacks ripped through her as the protagonist stayed glued to her side. Latte showed up and immediately looked terrified, saying straight out that Amira was in serious shape. Even with every sign of pain, Amira tried to wave it off and claim she was fine. The Guardian and 2 others watched from nearby until Amira finally dropped the bombshell. The Golden Destruction Core was on the way. Latte shot back a gasp the moment the Golden Destruction Core got mentioned, and even with Amira still clearly sick, she steadied herself and made it crystal clear. She was going straight to them.